You imagine history's grand halls, kings at feasts, generals at war, thinkers with ink-stained hands. But beneath the scrolls and triumphs, there was another history. One written in blood, rot, ash, and silence. The history of those who served, not with swords or ideas, but with bodies bent to unbearable labor. They were the unseen scaffolding of civilization. The leech collector standing ankle-deep in swamp water, offering his own skin to slithering mouths. The chimney sweep, a child no older than 6, coughing soot from blackened lungs in a city that never knew his name. The tanner, the plague barrier, the eunuch. They carried society's waste, its fears, its sins. And yet, without them, there would be no palaces, no peace, no progress. This is not the story of kings. It's the story of their shadows, of lives discarded yet essential, erased yet unforgettable, of jobs so dehumanizing, so foul, so spiritually crushing, that even speaking their names once brought shame. But tonight, we speak them. We remember, not to pity, but to understand. Because if you truly want to know how a society worked, don't ask who ruled it. Ask who cleaned it. Ask who buried its dead, scraped its floors, and caught its rats. Ask who held the line between civilization and collapse. With nothing but a shovel, a bucket, or a broken body. These are the most miserable jobs in history. And this is why they mattered. You wake before the sun, not to greet the day, but to bleed for it. The marsh is still dark when you step in, barefoot, half-clothed, waist-deep in yesterday's cold. The water hugs your legs like a death shroud. Around you, mist, silence, and the slow churn of breath in your chest. You don't need to move quickly. Your prey will find you. You are the bait. The world has forgotten you already. There are no records of your name, no portraits, no poems carved in your honor. Just the memory of your labor, soaked in mud and blood. You are a leech collector. In medieval Europe through the 19th century, they called it a job. But it was a slow unraveling of the self. A daily march into the soft belly of the earth, into bogs, ponds, and stagnant water, where medicine met misery. There were no nets or gloves, just flesh. To find leeches, you let them find you. You stood still as the slimy swarm crept toward warmth. You waited until they latched on, one by one, curling like ribbons around your calves. Then, once they were fat with your blood, you scraped them off and sealed them in jars. Gently, like treasure. Because they were. Doctors needed them. Apothecaries paid for them. Whole hospitals relied on their hunger. But they drank from you first. The process wasn't quick. Hours passed in knee-high filth as you waded from one infested pool to another. Rain didn't stop you. Wind didn't spare you. Insects, midges, flies, gnats fed on you as eagerly as the leeches did. And when you returned, there was no rest. Only the sting of red welts, the itch of infection, the long trail of dried blood on your thighs. The pain didn't come from the bite, not at first. Leeches are kind that way. They numb the flesh before they dig in. But after, the bleeding wouldn't stop. Their saliva kept the wounds open, 10 times their weight in blood. That's what each one could take, and you let them. Because your family needed bread, because your landlord needed rent, because the town physician needed one more jar of living syringes. They called it noble work, essential, but never honorable. No one wanted to shake the hand of a leech collector. No one invited them to dinner. You were seen, if at all, as a thing that emerged from the mud, half animal, half ghost, to bring back a cure no one wanted to touch. They wrote about you sometimes. A Victorian commentator once said you earned your living by wading into muddy pools. A thankless job, but one pursued with enough dedication. William Wordsworth, the poet, remembered meeting one, an old man who walked from pond to pond to gather leeches. He called it hazardous, wearisome. But what those words couldn't capture was the cold, the deep, marrow-dragging cold that never left your bones, even in midsummer. Or the shame, not of your labor, but of how the world looked away from it. Medicine was evolving, science was advancing, and yet the clean white linens of the doctor's table were stained with your blood first. Without you, their cures were just theory. Leeches were everything to the old world's physicians. In the humoral system of medicine, imbalance was treated by subtraction. You bled to relieve fever. You bled to soothe inflammation. You bled for headaches, heartbreaks, and hysteria. You bled so the body could find its balance again. And who brought the tools for that bleeding? You did. You, with your tattered hemline and infected calves. You, with your jars of writhing, twitching worms that smelled of rot and rust. You didn't study at university. You didn't write treatises. But you knew what others didn't. You knew the ponds, the rhythms of the marshes, the silence that came just before the water stirred. You learned how to let the leeches come without flinching, how to bleed without complaint. You knew how to disappear too, because the job didn't end in the field. It followed you home, in your bedsheets, stained, in your reflection, pale, in the way your neighbors crossed themselves when you passed. You were not evil, but you were a reminder, a walking emblem of all that civilization relied on but refused to embrace. You made healing possible, but no one wanted to know your name. And maybe that's why it mattered so much. Because there, in that forgotten swamp, society's contradictions revealed themselves. You were both servant and sacrifice. You fed the system with your pain. And like so many others through history, the rat catcher, the Gong Farmer, the plague barrier, you became the unspoken backbone of progress. Even when the work made you sick, even when it shortened your life, even when the species of leech itself began to vanish, driven to near extinction by the insatiable hunger of medicine, still you returned to the water. Why? Because no one else would. Because someone had to. Your hands trembled, but you held the jar steady. Your body ached, but you stood still. You did what the clean hands of scholars could not do. You gave, and in giving, you disappeared. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember them, not as martyrs, not as monsters, but as humans, shivering in the mud, wrapped in twilight, bleeding for a world that barely noticed. They were not just leech collectors. They were the quiet heartbeat of healing, and their pain kept others alive. The church bells had stopped ringing. The markets had gone quiet. The laughter of children had vanished from the streets. All that remained was the sound of wheels, wooden wheels, dragging across stone, and the call that echoed like a dirge through every alley. Bring out your dead. You were a plague barrier, or perhaps just someone desperate enough to become one. You didn't start your life here, shovel in hand and death at your heels. But fate, or poverty, or fear of starvation brought you to the edge of the pit, to the edge of civilization, and made you its last defender. When the plague came, it didn't knock. It howled. It bled through the walls of cities. It cloaked itself in coughs and sores and fever dreams. It moved faster than understanding, faster than prayer. And when the priests stopped blessing the corpses, and the doctors stopped knocking on doors, The only ones left to face it were men like you. Not soldiers, not saints. Just men with strong backs, hollow stomachs, and no other choice. You began before the sun did, sharpening your pickaxe, your spade. There was no plan, no map of the city's dead. Only the smell to guide you. That sour, sickly rot that told you which houses still had bodies left inside. Some were bundled in cloth, some lay in piles, some still had their eyes open. And all of them, all, had to be moved before the next wave came. It wasn't a burial, it was a race. A race against contagion, a race against time. You pried open doors and coffins alike. You heaved limp forms by the belt, by the shoulder, by the hair if you had to. You loaded them onto carts until the wood bent and groaned. Some slipped off as you rolled through the lanes. Some fell apart before they even reached the pit. You learned to breathe through your mouth. You learned not to look them in the eye. You learned that silence was your only armor, because the living feared you too. They didn't see you as a savior. They saw you as tainted, a walking miasma. You touched the dead. You wore the disease on your skin, they believed. So they crossed the street when you passed. Some threw stones, some prayed at your back, and yet without you, they would not have survived. The pit was always deeper than memory, 30 feet, sometimes more, dug into soil so damp it tried to swallow the shovel with every thrust. You stood at the edge, your body caked in mud and bile, and tipped them in, one after the next. Fathers, daughters, lovers, priests, layer upon layer, separated by lye or quicklime or cloth, but never truly apart. There was no time for eulogies, no time for final words, just the sound of the dirt falling, the dull thump of it landing on bone, the smell of rot splitting open under the weight. They warned you, don't puncture the skin. They said the buboes, those black bloated boils, could burst and spread death like smoke. But sometimes your shovel hit bone in the dark. Sometimes a corpse split open in your hands. Sometimes the stench knocked you off your feet. They said one breath of mephitic vapors could infect you, that the air itself was poison. And maybe it was. You coughed for weeks. Your skin broke out in sores. Your friends, if you still had any, stopped visiting. Even your dreams began to rot. And still, you returned. Because the bodies never stopped, and the dead don't bury themselves. Some of the buriers were conscripted. Prisoners promised freedom if they could survive long enough. Others were beggars, drunks, orphans. Some were fathers who hadn't buried their own families yet. One day you'd bury strangers, the next your neighbor, then your brother, then your wife. And then, one morning, you'd arrive at a door and realize it was your own, and you'd go inside, but you wouldn't stay there, because this wasn't just horror, it was duty. You carried out the last rites of civilization when no priest would. You gave the dead a place to rest, even if it was shared with 100 others. You made it possible for the city to go on, even if you didn't. People remember the plague for its death toll. They remember the masks, the fires, the fear. But what they forget is that order did not fall. The cities didn't collapse. Markets opened again. Children laughed again. Why? Because the plague barriers held the line, not with banners or swords, but with blistered hands, and the courage to walk into the homes everyone else had abandoned. You bore witness to the worst of humanity, and the best, to parents cradling fevered children, to neighbors sharing crusts of bread across thresholds marked with chalk, to those who stayed, not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. You were not a hero. You were a necessity. You were the unacknowledged final chapter in thousands of lives. Samuel Pepys wrote of you. He heard your wheels on the stones, your voice in the night. Bring out your dead, you called. And behind every call, a man, not a monster, not a shadow, but someone who once had a name lost to the pit. Tonight, we remember it. We remember that history doesn't just belong to kings and chronicles. It belongs to the ones who cleaned the mess, closed the eyes, and did the work no one wanted. So when you think of plague, don't think only of disease. Think of the one who carried the body, the one who dug the hole, the one who, against every fear, stayed. He may not have worn a crown, but he carried the weight of a kingdom. And that weight still echoes through the silence he left behind. The city sleeps, but you are just beginning. It's past midnight, and the streets are quiet, except for the slosh of a heavy bucket and the slow grind of a wooden cartwheel on cobblestone. You move in silence, in shadow, because your work is not meant to be seen. You are a Gong Farmer. No one speaks your name with pride. In fact, most try not to speak it at all. But when the rest of the world turns its nose away, you keep it breathing. When the rest of the world eats, digests, and discards, you clean what's left behind. You are the final stop in the chain of civilization. And every night, you crawl into its belly. In medieval and early modern England, cities ran not on plumbing, but pits. Deep, dark cesspools of human waste buried beneath inns, manors, and tenements. And when those pits filled, they called you. Not during the day, never in daylight. Your labor was confined to darkness. You arrived after sunset, bucket in hand, rope across your shoulder, sometimes with a boy to carry the smaller loads. And then, into the pit you went. Some you could stand in, some you crawled into, ankle deep at best, waist deep on the worst nights, neck deep when the rains came and the drains backed up. You worked by torchlight, or sometimes by touch alone. You lowered pipes into cesspools and listened for the thick gurgle of waste. You plunged in shovels and hauled out bucket after bucket of night soil. The polite name for what others refused to name at all. It clung to your boots. It soaked into your shirt. It coated your skin in a film no soap could scrub. The smell, it became part of you. A pungent mixture of ammonia and decay, of meat long rotted, of sickness, of life reduced to sludge. There were nights when you felt the walls tremble. Cesspits were not made for men. They were not reinforced. They could collapse in an instant, burying you alive in the very waste you came to remove. Some did. Others suffocated. The fumes, thick, invisible, and poisonous, stole breath in seconds. You learned to hold your breath, to work fast, to memorize where not to step. But nothing could save you from the rot, from the infections that festered in your skin, from the sores that opened across your body, slow and weeping, from the nights you came home wheezing, feverish, with the stench still trapped in your lungs. They said you were cursed, that your trade marked you, and in a way it did. Even after you emerged, scrubbed raw, with the pit behind you, the world didn't forget. You were a nightman, a Gong Farmer. You carried the scent of shame. Neighbors avoided you. Markets refused you. Churches closed their doors when you passed. Children learned your job as a warning, not a path. You were the bottom rung, the living symbol of everything polite society wanted to ignore. And yet, without you, the streets would drown in filth. Every night, you emptied cesspools so homes could function. Every night, you hauled waste through alleyways and dumped it at lay stalls, the refuse dumps outside city walls, From there, it was carted off to farms, spread across fields, and transformed into something useful. Your labor fed the land. The same people who wouldn't shake your hand ate bread grown in soil you fertilized. The same nobles who passed you in silence wore boots softened by hides tanned in your recycled waste. You lived in a paradox, vital and invisible, despised and necessary, feared and forgotten. They told stories of you, of men swallowed by pits, of a Gong farmer sentenced to punishment in his own pipe, buried to his neck in the filth he once cleared, of the ones who vanished one night and were found days later, bloated, stiff, unrecognizable in the pit's slurry. Even when you survived, you never really returned. Because who were you? Once you'd become this, you didn't dress like others. You worked while they slept. You spoke only to your own. Your world was shadows and steam, excrement and endurance. And still, you kept going, because someone had to. Because cities don't run on architecture alone. They run on the backs of the unseen, the ones who shovel, the ones who scrape, the ones who make room for life to continue. You weren't a doctor, but your work prevented plague. You weren't a priest, but you kept the sacred spaces clean. You weren't a noble, but your labor fed their land and carried away their sins. Each night, you stepped into the worst of humanity, and each morning, you left it just a little cleaner. History doesn't speak of you. You didn't write books or wage wars, but without you, those who did would have drowned in their own waste. There is a kind of holiness in what you did, a purity in confronting filth with purpose, a dignity in doing what no one else dared. You weren't just hauling dung. You were preserving civilization, one bucket at a time. So tonight, in the hush of sleep, remember this. Every candle-lit banquet in medieval England, every velvet chamber, every polished hall, rested on a foundation that stank of rot and labor. A foundation someone had to clean. That someone was you. You were not honored. You were not thanked. But you kept the walls from crumbling. You kept the streets from flooding. You carried away the filth no one wanted to see, and with it, carried the weight of a society too proud to bend. So to the nameless nightmen, the pit-born laborers, the farmers of the city's darkest harvest, we see you, we remember, and we walk cleaner paths because of your unseen hands. You don't talk much anymore, not in the square, not in the tavern, not even at home, if home is still a place that accepts you. You weren't born into this, or maybe you were. Maybe it's been in your family for generations, passed down like a curse sealed in the bloodline. Either way, you've come to accept it. You are not a soldier, though you kill, not a priest, though the condemned whisper to you in their final moments, not a judge, though your hands deliver the verdict. You are the blade. You are the silence. You are the final breath before the crowd gasps and history moves on. Execution day begins before dawn. You sharpen the sword, test the edge with your thumb. You inspect the gallows rope, coiled tight and clean. Every knot matters. Every inch of steel must be perfect. Mistakes cannot happen. A missed swing, a failed drop, a hesitation, and the execution becomes a spectacle of cruelty instead of order. One mistake, and the crowd's horror turns into fury. Panic spreads faster than blood. The fear that keeps the city in line begins to crack. You are not just carrying out justice. You are holding the weight of civilization's illusion of control. When the condemned arrives, you look at them. Only once. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they spit. Sometimes they pray to gods you stopped believing in long ago. You tie their hands. You position their body. And then you do it. Swiftly, without ceremony, without pause. You end a life, and the crowd either cheers, shudders, or turns away. It doesn't matter. They came for blood, not understanding. Afterward, the work isn't done. You clean the blood from the wood. You burn what needs burning. You carry what remains. You don't speak to anyone. You pack the tools in silence. Then you walk home, if you can call it that. A small house at the edge of town, far from the baker, far from the church. You don't live among the people you protect. They won't let you. They see you as necessary, but never noble. You're whispered about, avoided. Children are warned not to go near your door. Shopkeepers close early when they see you walking past. You might earn more than a cobbler or a butcher, but your coin is touched with death. Even off duty, you are marked. In some towns, you are required to wear a symbol of your trade. In others, your presence alone is the mark, a face too familiar with endings. You didn't choose this, or maybe your father did, and his father before him. You were born into a legacy of silence and steel. You don't have the luxury of regret. The role is not just a job, it is a condition. One you carry in your bones, in your posture, in the way you look at crowds and never fully step into them. You are outside the city even when you are inside it. People forget that executioners don't only swing the blade. They do the things no one else will. When no one wants to touch the bodies, you're the one who buries them. When stray dogs are tearing at the remains, you're the one who chases them off. Sometimes you dispose of animal carcasses. Sometimes you clean what the plague leaves behind. You don't just carry out death, you clean up after it. And yet, there is a strange irony, because in private, they come to you for healing. Not openly, not with witnesses, but in the dead of night, mothers bring their children with broken limbs, farmers with torn hands, thieves with infected wounds they dare not show anyone else. You know the body, where to cut, where to mend. You've studied it in its most vulnerable state, and so the man they fear by day becomes the healer they whisper for at night. Franz Schmidt, a 16th century executioner, once said he healed more people than he killed. His journal is full of entries not about heads severed, but bones realigned and sickness soothed. Still, no one remembered him for that. The blood stays longer in the memory than the balm. The loneliness is worse than the violence. You could survive the stares, the shame, the smell of smoke in your clothes, if not for the isolation. You live apart. You marry only within your kind, if you marry at all. Children born to you carry your name, and with it, your fate. There's no running from it, no escape, only repetition, only the next scaffold, the next cry, the next silence. You become good at silence. You walk through crowds unnoticed, yet completely seen. People pretend not to know who you are, but their eyes betray them. They know, and they are grateful, secretly, that it is you and not them, that someone else has taken on this necessary darkness. And it is necessary. The state demands a visible form of justice. Fear keeps people in line. The gallows, the block, the burning stake. They are more than punishments. They are rituals, public affirmations of control. Every execution is a reminder that law still has teeth, that chaos has not yet claimed the square. You are the mouth of that law. You are its teeth. But you are not made of stone. You remember faces. You remember the ones who were guilty. You remember the ones who weren't. You remember the girl who sang before the noose tightened. The man who thanked you for making it quick. The boy whose knees gave out before he reached the block. These memories don't haunt you like ghosts. They stay with you more quietly, like a shadow cast at dusk. Always there, but hard to hold. You don't seek forgiveness. There is no confessor for what you do. No priest wants to bless your hands. And yet, you keep them steady. Because someone must. Because power has a face. And it's not the king's. It's yours. Hidden beneath the hood. Standing before the trembling crowd. So tonight, remember that history was not built only by rulers and scholars and soldiers. It was also shaped by hands that wiped the blood from the stone, by voices that called for silence when the crowd roared too loud, by those who understood that justice, real justice, is never clean. The executioner is not a villain. He is a mirror, held up to a world that demands order but cannot bear to watch how it is maintained. He is the quiet enforcer of peace, the unwilling architect of endings. And though his name is often forgotten, his work remains, etched into the stone, soaked into the soil, whispered in the space between punishment and mercy. He never knocked. He was never invited. His arrival was understood, like the final breath of the dying. Inevitable, unwelcome, necessary. The door would creak open just wide enough for him to slip through, damp with mud, wrapped in silence, eyes lowered to the floor. They didn't look at him, and he didn't expect them to. His presence marked the end of something, not just a life, but a boundary between the sacred and the profane. He was a sin-eater. They called him only when the priest would not come, when the family feared that death had arrived faster than forgiveness, when a soul teetered too close to damnation. That was his summons, not love, not mourning, but fear. Fear that the sins of the departed would stain the living, that unless someone took them, physically, ritually, the dead would wander restless, tainted, unredeemed. So they laid the body out on the table or floor, a crust of bread and a mug of ale placed on the chest, and the sin-eater would kneel. He'd whisper nothing, just eat, bite by stale bite, swallow the ale, sour and flat. And in that act, the body was cleansed, the spirit freed, but he was not. The ritual was quiet, but the hatred after was not. As soon as the bread was gone, the curses began. The salt, the ashes, the pointed fingers. Some families shoved him out the door with sticks. Others spat on the ground behind him. Children were taught to whisper rhymes that ended in his isolation. All fall down, they chant, except for the sin-eater, who stood alone, forgotten even by metaphor. He bore it, because he had no choice. No one chose to become a sin-eater. You were either born into it, the child of a previous outcast, or driven to it by poverty so deep that even dignity had become a luxury. The payment was a coin, maybe two, dropped without touch into a filthy palm. Enough for bread, enough for drink, but never enough for belonging. He lived outside the village, in a shack that was always damp and smelled of mold and smoke. No one visited. No one helped. If he became ill, he healed alone. If he died, no priest would come, for he had eaten too many sins to be clean. The weight of them, not just spiritual, but emotional, visceral, clung to his skin, to his smell, to the very shape of his silence. Each ritual was a reminder. Each body, a farmer, a mother, a child, had left something behind. Lust, rage, theft, betrayal, fear. And as the families wept in private, he swallowed all that residue. He made no judgment. That wasn't his role, but it changed him. He grew quieter over time. The first few years, he might have tried to speak to someone. A butcher's boy, a stable hand, a widow who once offered him old stew. But those moments faded. The looks they gave him were worse than isolation, as if he carried disease, as if sin were contagious and he was its host. And yet, they needed him. In a world obsessed with purity, he became a vessel. Sometimes he'd sit alone at night and speak aloud to no one in particular. Not prayers, not confessions, just questions. Where do sins go when you eat them? Do they change you? Do they stain your bones? Or do they simply vanish into the air, into history, into myth? No one ever answered. As the years went on, fewer families performed the rite. Priests returned to homes they once avoided. Medicine began to explain what superstition had wrapped in ritual. But even then, there were those who called him. Quietly, privately. Those who believed or feared, or simply couldn't sleep until the bread was eaten, the ale was drunk, and the burden was passed. And he, older now, slower, still went. He never refused. Even when his hands shook, even when the coins felt colder, even when he could no longer taste the food. Because sin eating wasn't about appetite. It was about presence, about bearing witness, about being the one to stay when others left the room. When he died, no one marked it. His body was found by accident, cold, curled beside a half-burned hearth, a crust of bread on the floor, a mug of stale ale nearby. Perhaps he'd performed the rite for himself, one final time. Perhaps no one else would. He was buried far from town, as predicted. A shallow grave, no cross, no mourners, just the wind and the trees and the hush of earth receiving one more forgotten servant. But his story, like the sins he swallowed, didn't disappear. It lingered. In whispers, in old rhymes, in the way some villagers still leave out bread when the house feels heavy, in the hush that falls over a room when someone mentions the name no one quite remembers. Because deep down, every society needs someone to carry what it cannot face. The Sin Eater was not a hero, not a villain. He was a necessity, a breathing paradox, both cursed and essential, reviled, yet relied upon. And in his quiet, miserable service, he revealed more about human nature than any king or cleric. He showed us that sometimes, to keep the illusion of purity, we must find someone to dirty their hands, someone willing to eat the weight of what we cannot bear to name. And in doing so, he became the ghost of our own guilt, wandering not for justice, but for recognition. Let him be seen. Let him be remembered. Let the Sin Eater, for once, be clean. They called it the resurrection trade, a profession not born of holy light or spiritual rebirth, but of midnight soil and silent wheels. In the blackened alleys of 18th and 19th century Britain, these men worked not in sunlight, but in fog, not in prayer, but in whispers. They were the resurrectionists, body snatchers, grave robbers, and what they stole wasn't gold or silver, but the very flesh of the dead. It was never personal. The graves they dug belonged to strangers. The names on the headstones meant nothing, only that the ground was fresh, the burial recent. Each new mound of earth was an opportunity, a commodity, a means of survival. They waited for funerals to end. They watched from tree lines and behind crypts, counting the steps of mourners as they left. Then, as the town drifted into sleep and the lamplighters dimmed the last flames, the resurrectionists would begin. The technique was swift and efficient. They didn't dig the whole grave, just enough at the head to crack open the coffin. A crowbar, a shovel, and a few minutes of quiet, practiced force. They worked in pairs or gangs, one digging, one watching, one holding the horse cart nearby. They slipped cloth harnesses under the arms or around the neck of the corpse, and with grunts and curses hauled it up like cargo. The body, stiff and cold, was wrapped in tarpaulin or straw. Sometimes its jaw hung open. Sometimes its eyes had not yet fully closed. The smell was unbearable. Earth, rot, damp wood, and the sour stench of decomposing flesh. One account likened it to boiled beef left in the sun. The men gagged often. Some brought cloth soaked in vinegar or peppermint to cover their noses. But you could never get used to it. The human body, when unearthed, carried a weight beyond mass. It carried the memory of life turned silent, the echo of mourning, the scent of a soul gone somewhere else. They were not killers, though some accused them of such. The infamous Burke and Hare murders stained the trade permanently. Those two had taken shortcuts, creating corpses when the ground no longer provided. But most resurrectionists were not murderers. They were scavengers, not predators. Their work was illegal, yes, but driven by need. Medical schools needed cadavers. Surgeons needed bodies to cut, to map, to understand. And the law only allowed the dissection of executed criminals, which were few and politically delicate. The demand was greater than the supply. So the resurrectionists rose. Edinburgh, London, Manchester, cities where surgeons whispered to known men, paid in unmarked coins and sealed handshakes. The corpses would be delivered before dawn, often through the back door of anatomy theatres, bundled in blankets or sacks. Students would arrive with scalpels in hand, pretending not to ask where the body had come from. Sometimes the snatchers stayed to watch, not for science, but to make sure the payment came. There was always risk. Watchmen patrolled graveyards with dogs and lanterns. Grieving families hired guards to sleep near graves. Some booby-trapped the sites with spring-loaded guns or buried iron cages called mort safes over the coffin. And yet, the resurrectionists found ways, bribed the keepers, dug during thunderstorms to mask the sound, moved fast, left no trace, burned quicklime over the disturbed earth to disguise the soil. If caught, the punishment varied. Fines, jail, beatings from angry mobs. No one wanted their loved ones stolen for slicing. Even those who believed in science recoiled at the image of a daughter or mother laid bare on a dissecting table. The resurrectionists were hated, feared, yet always needed. Most lived poorly. Their coin went fast, often into drink or silence. They lived on the edges of society, in rented rooms, unwashed and anonymous. No one praised them. No one remembered their names. But the doctors did. The students did. Each incision made in those cold amphitheatres led to the saving of lives. Better surgeries, safer births, a deeper understanding of the body. And all of it rested on the work done in the dark, with the muddy boots and trembling hands. One medical student wrote of receiving a body wrapped in sackcloth and bound with twine, the toes still wet with dew. Another described the cadaver's eyes as wide, as if surprised at where it had gone. The students spoke of their learning with awe and revulsion. They understood what it took to bring the dead to their table. Some honored it. Some forgot. But the resurrectionists never could. There was a rhythm to the trade. Winter was best. Cold preserved the bodies longer. Storms offered cover. Holidays brought distraction. They planned with precision. They drank to forget. They laughed too loudly in the public houses and went quiet when strangers asked questions. And always they returned to the soil. In 1832, the Anatomy Act changed everything. It allowed surgeons to access unclaimed corpses legally, paupers, orphans, those who died in hospitals or workhouses with no kin. The resurrection trade dried up almost overnight. The surgeons no longer needed the shadows. The men who had once been essential became obsolete. Some faded into other trades. Some drank themselves to death. A few, perhaps, returned to graves, but this time as their final resting place, and no one dug them back up. History rarely remembers the Resurrectionists with gratitude. Their work was too grim, their methods too profane. But look deeper, and their role becomes clearer. Without them, the surgeons would have worked blind. The students would have studied only diagrams and dreams. It was these muddy-handed men who placed the human body into the light of reason. They did not speak of justice, or progress, or duty. They only spoke of the weight of a body, the sound of a coffin lid cracking, the breath held when a watchman passed. They were thieves, yes, but what they stole became knowledge. What they disturbed became healing. And maybe, in the strange arithmetic of history, that is enough. There are trades born of light, and trades born of necessity. And then there are trades like tanning, born of blood, sweat, and an unbearable stench that clings to your skin long after you've left the yard. In the winding outskirts of towns, from ancient Rome to medieval Paris, from York to Florence, there stood pits. Not graves, but they might as well have been. Rows of deep, dark vats filled with strange, steaming liquids. This was the tanner's domain. No cloistered workshop, no painted shutters. Just air thick with the sour fog of death and transformation. The day began before light. Animal hides arrived still warm, still red. Some bore flecks of straw, others faint smells of the slaughterhouse. The tanner's first task, to remove what the butcher left behind, flesh, hair, fat, all of it scraped by hand with rounded knives on thick beams worn smooth by years of work. Lime and urine were used to soften the skin, not metaphorically, literally. The skin soaked in baths of human and animal waste, where enzymes began to strip them down to their most basic state. The smell, indescribable. Ammonia from urine, sulfur from the hair, hydrogen sulfide from rotting flesh. It wasn't a single stench. It was a cloud of layered horror, alive in the nose, in the lungs, in the eyes. One 19th century writer said no scent in all of Europe or Asia could rival the reek of a tannery. Another simply called it diabolical. But the tanner pressed on. After dehairing, the hides were dunked into deeper vats, some filled with oak bark steeped for days, others with acidic brews thick as broth. These tannins were the heart of the process. They cured the hide, hardened it into something that would not rot, something that could outlast a man. But it took weeks, sometimes months. The hides had to be turned, lifted, stretched. Leather, it turns out, doesn't form on its own. It must be coaxed from decay. And while they waited, the tanners didn't rest. They boiled oils, smoked hides, rubbed them with animal brains and greases. They cracked the leather across wooden frames to soften it. They hammered it flat on stone. Their arms ached, their backs curved, their skin, constantly soaked in acid and grime, blistered and peeled. There was no escaping the job, not just because of the poverty that forced most into it, but because even when you left the yard, the work clung to you. Neighbors crossed the street. Children pinched their noses. In many towns, tanners were required to live outside the city walls, not because they were criminals, but because no one wanted the smell near their bread or prayers. Tanners married tanners. They birthed children into the trade. Their hands became thick, calloused, permanently stained. They ate apart, drank apart. In church, they sat near the doors. Some were forbidden from touching sacred objects. Others simply stopped attending altogether. Their work was essential, But they themselves were forgotten, and yet the world needed them, desperately. Without tanners, there were no boots, no saddles, no belts, no harnesses to pull carts, no leather-bound books, no sheaths for blades, no bellows for forges. The very engines of medieval life ran on the backs of those who worked in pits of filth. Knights wore their craft on the battlefield. Priests read their sermons from their labor. Artisans crafted tools using their hides. Even children took first steps in shoes softened by a tanner's hand. Every stage of life, birth, war, work, death, passed through leather. And yet, society pretended not to see them, as if leather simply appeared, as if the stench was someone else's burden. Tanners were the shadow workers, the ones who made comfort possible while living in discomfort themselves. Many died young. Exposure to toxic fumes, infections from hides, anthrax, skin diseases, respiratory failure. The very materials they labored over could turn on them in a moment, and still they came. Each morning, stepping into a job where the air could make you sick and the pay kept you poor. There were no songs written for tanners, no ballads or banners, just the slow beat of work, the scraping of hides, the thud of leather stretched taut, the silence of men who endured because they had no other choice. In time, cities changed. Chemicals replaced urine. Machines replaced muscle. And yet, even today, the legacy remains. Modern leather still owes its beginnings to those early yards. The techniques refined, the smells subdued, but the sacrifice, the real cost, that remains buried in history. Think of that next time you tie your shoes, or flip a page, or rest your head on a leather seat. Somewhere in that luxury is a story of a man, waist deep in rot, who gave up his comfort so you could have yours. He was a tanner. His job was miserable, and it mattered. They were barely more than children, and yet the fire of empire ran through their fingers. The Matchstick Girls of Victorian England lit an entire nation, not with torches or oil lamps, but with their pain. In dim East End factories, with air thick as soup and ceilings barely higher than hope, they painted light onto sticks and swallowed the darkness it left behind. They came by the hundreds, orphans, daughters of laborers, girls too young for sorrow, and yet already carrying it. Bryant and May's match factory, the largest in the East End, welcomed them not with warmth, but with cold benches, bitter rules, and a daily ritual of silent endurance. Their tasks were not complicated, but they were cruel. Hour after hour, they dipped wooden slivers into trays of white phosphorus paste, coating each end with the chemical that would later spark a flame, or rot their jaws. The paste was toxic. Everyone knew it. Its sweet, sickly smell clung to their skin, hair and lungs like invisible mold. It made food taste bitter, air feel sticky, and breath come with effort. They worked without gloves, without masks, without mercy. The phosphorus dust settled on everything. On lunch bread, on lashes, on the backs of hands rubbed raw from repetition. It shimmered faintly in the dark like fairy dust. Only this dust corroded the body from the inside out. Supervisors watched over them like hawks. For every tiny mistake, a misaligned bundle, a missed dip, came a fine. And the fines added up faster than the pennies they earned. Some girls ended the week owing money to the factory. Those who fainted from heat or hunger were often scolded, not helped. There was no room for fragility in the match girls' world. To survive, they had to harden. But not even steel could protect them from what came next. The disease struck silently. First a mild ache in the jaw, barely enough to notice. Then swelling, then pain, then horror. Phossy jaw, the girls called it. A disease born of white phosphorus exposure. It chewed through the face like acid. The jawbone would die, turn to powder, and push its way out through abscesses in the mouth and cheeks. Pus filled the air with a stench so unbearable even loved ones would flee the room. Some girls lost all their teeth, others their faces. There was no treatment, only the slow public unravelling of identity. Annie Besant, a writer and activist, heard their whispers in 1888. She published an exposé describing how the infection led to putrid abscesses that oozed bone fragments the size of peas, and how girls were told to simply have the tooth out and return to work. One girl, pregnant and terrified, refused the extraction, fearing the shock would kill her unborn child. Many died in silence, not just because their mouths decayed, but because their voices were never allowed to matter. Their homes offered no refuge. Most Matchstick Girls lived in overcrowded tenements where 5 shared a bed. Blankets were thin, and winter seeped in through the floorboards. The East End was a labyrinth of poverty. Rotting timber, sewage-choked streets, and alleyways where rats scurried and the air never quite cleared. After 12-hour shifts, the girls returned to these frozen corners of London with phosphorus in their lungs and blisters on their feet. Still, they returned each day. Why? Because there was nothing else. Workhouses were worse. Domestic service often came with abuse. Marriage was out of reach for girls whose jaws rotted and whose breath smelled of death. Brian and May offered just enough to survive. And survival was more than many could hope for. But they weren't machines. And in 1888, they reminded the world of that. The spark began with a few girls. Sick of the fines, sick of watching friends die with coin-sized holes in their skulls, they whispered a protest. Annie Besant helped them organize. Word spread like wildfire. One morning, they didn't show up to work. It was unthinkable. Girls didn't strike. Not then. Not them. But these girls did. Over 1,400 match girls walked out, some with bandaged jaws, others barely strong enough to stand. They carried signs. They sang. They told their stories to anyone who would listen. And finally, people did. Newspapers ran headlines about the matchstick martyrs. Parliament stirred. The public, previously content to strike a match and forget who made it, began to care. Besant's articles revealed the rot beneath the nation's glow. The living dead, she called them, girls who glowed in the dark, but whose light came at the cost of flesh and bone. Doctors testified. The press descended, and under pressure, Brian and May relented. The strike ended with a victory. The fines were abolished, wages improved, and soon legislation followed. In 1908, the use of white phosphorus in matches was banned. The work became safer, and the lives were spared. But the girls who won that fight, most of them never saw the change. They had already vanished. No statues were built, no names carved into stone. Their graves are mostly unmarked, their photos scarce. What remains are fragments. A few newspaper illustrations, some court testimonies, a dusty play script titled The Match Girls. Yet their legacy burns on in every labour reform, every safe workplace, every factory regulation won through pain. They were not warriors, but they fought. Not politicians, but they changed policy. They were girls, some 12, some younger, and they rewrote history with nothing but phosphorus and fury. Think of one. Imagine her, 16, teeth aching, scarf wrapped tight around her face. She dips a match in poison. Her fingers are blistered. Her stomach is empty. Her dreams are small. A warm bed, a clean apron, a life that doesn't hurt. She finishes her bundle. She coughs. She reaches for the next. She doesn't know she's changing the world. She's just trying to get through the shift. That's the tragedy and the miracle. They lit the matches that lit the lamps that lit the empire. And for that, they were discarded, diseased, forgotten. But not anymore. So next time you strike a match, pause. Think of the girl who painted it. The one whose hands carried the fire. The one whose jaw turned to dust. The one who never got to grow up, but who made it possible for others to live, breathe, and be safe. She was a matchstick girl. Her job was miserable, and it mattered. The fire was warm, the hearth comforting. Its glow spilled across brick floors and nursery walls, chasing shadows and chill. But every flicker of flame carried a debt, a hidden cost, a forgotten child. In the underbelly of industrial Britain, where fog wrapped factories like shrouds and soot stained every rooftop slate, a boy climbed a chimney. He was no taller than the iron poker beside the hearth. Bare-chested, skin pale beneath black streaks, eyes red from ash, often no older than 6, sometimes younger. His ribs showed, his breath fogged in the morning chill, and still he climbed. Woken before dawn, he ate a crust of bread, maybe less. Then the brush was handed to him, stiff-bristled, heavy, longer than his entire body. His master stood beside the hearth, tapping the flue with a rod. The climb would begin. He stepped into darkness. Inside the shaft, silence pressed against his eardrums. The light vanished. Just soot, brick, breath. He clambered upward through the narrow flue, 12 inches across, sometimes less. Elbows tucked tight, knees braced. One wrong move could wedge him still. The shaft could become his tomb. His task was simple. Scrape away the soot that lined the chimney walls. But simple did not mean safe. His knees bled. His knuckles cracked. Each brushstroke stirred a cloud of dust, dry, bitter, stinging. It filled his lungs, seared his throat. Every inhale left behind something black, and still, he climbed. Some chimneys were straight, some bent at odd angles. To pass the twists, he had to contort, curling like a wire, flattening ribs against the stone. Claustrophobia was not an option. If fear rose, he swallowed it. Panic meant death. There were stories, always stories, of boys who cried out, jammed fast, and were pulled out lifeless. One chimney caught fire from below. The master hadn't checked. The flames rose as the boy descended, kissing his legs, then devouring them. He lived for 2 more days. But this was routine. These were the sweeps. They were not sons. They were labor. The soot embedded in their pores. Their skin turned grey. Their eyes became hollow. Their breath whistled like wind through cracked windows. Chimney sweep's lung, the doctors called it. Or worse, a peculiar form of cancer, rare and cruel, that struck only boys who had spent their youth inside flues. Tumours bloomed from the scrotum, from the lungs, from within. They coughed blood. They limped before adolescence. Some never reached it. Their lives were governed by the master sweep, often a former climber himself, hardened and cruel. He carried a rod, or sometimes a belt. He doled out scraps. He beat the slow. He rented the smallest boys to wealthier clients, collecting coin and bruises alike. The boys lived in cellars, in wooden crates, in coal shacks behind factories. Their beds were straw and damp. Their clothes were rags. No schooling, no joy, only soot. They were invisible, except when something went wrong. In one parish, a boy was stuck for 7 hours. His screams echoed through the wall. When they finally broke it open, he had suffocated, arms raised above his head, mouth wide. In another, a child fell headfirst into a fire grate, his body so emaciated it folded in half. And yet, society looked away. Parents sold children into apprenticeship for a few pounds. Some were orphans, some were taken from workhouses. The law permitted it, the clergy excused it, the public accepted it. Because chimneys had to be clean, a clogged flue was a death sentence. Fire, smoke inhalation, carbon monoxide. In a world lit by coal and warmed by wood, chimney sweeps were necessary. Without them, cities would choke, homes would burn, babies would never wake. So children climbed. They were trained to fear softness, to avoid sympathy. Older boys mocked the weak. The brush will make you a man, they said. But most were dead before 20. Few became masters. Fewer still escaped. The poet William Blake saw them. In 1794, he gave them a voice. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me, while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, weep, weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. It wasn't metaphor. It was testimony. By the early 1800s, reformers began to stir. Medical journals exposed the cancer. Journalists uncovered deaths. Campaigners, most notably Lord Shaftesbury, rallied for change. They pushed the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834, then again in 1840, then in 1864. Each time the age minimum rose. Each time enforcement failed, because fines were rare, bribes were common, and machines, mechanical brushes, were expensive. In 1863, a boy named Valentine Gray was beaten to death by his master for slow climbing. The coroner's report stunned the nation. The following year, new laws were written again. But nothing stopped until 1875. That year, a 12-year-old died in a flue. His body was twisted. The story made headlines. Parliament acted. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 banned the use of child labour in the profession. Inspections followed. The law finally had teeth. By then, thousands were gone. No monuments mark them. No names remain. Just the myth of the soot boy, cap askew, face blackened, brush in hand, sanitized by fiction, stripped of agony. But they were real. They mattered. They bore the weight of empire on their backs. Their work kept homes warm, kitchens lit, parlours safe. Their misery preserved the daily rituals of Victorian life, and their suffering forced the nation to look inward, to question profit at the expense of innocence. In every chimney sweep story lies a parable about comfort and cost, silence and sacrifice. So when the fire crackles and smoke curls upward, remember him, the boy who climbed, the child whose back scraped stone, whose lungs held soot, whose eyes never saw daylight. He was a chimney sweep. His job was miserable, and it mattered. There are places in history that are so dark, they swallow the memory of sunlight. The coal mine was one of them. In the 18th and 19th centuries, beneath the rising spires of industrial Britain and beyond, a different world pulsed below the surface. It was a world without time, without seasons, without sky. A world where men and women and children entered in the early hours, and often did not emerge until dusk, blackened and broken. These were the coal miners, and their job was not just miserable. It was brutal, it was silent, and it powered everything. The day began before daylight. A boy of 10, maybe less, kissed his mother's coarse cheek and slung a pickaxe over his tiny shoulder. His father had already gone, swallowed by the shaft hours before. Together, they were part of a nation's hunger. A hunger for coal, for steam, for fire. The boy didn't dream of escape. He dreamed of surviving the day without coughing blood. The mine entrance loomed like the mouth of the earth itself. As the child climbed into the wooden lift cage, the daylight narrowed above him until it was gone. A shuddering descent, a few hundred feet into the rock, and he stepped into blackness. The tunnels were barely tall enough to crouch in. Some weren't tall enough at all. Children crawled on hands and knees, pushing small carts called tubs, laden with freshly hacked coal. Their fingers became raw, their backs bent permanently forward, and still they worked. Some for 12 hours a day, some longer, their lungs filled with dust. Not the dust of streets or attics, but black dust, the fine choking remains of carbon inhaled with every breath. The miners coughed constantly, spasms echoing through the tunnels. Some would develop what was later called black lung, a disease that hardened the chest and shortened the breath until even walking became labor. And yet, walking was rare. Most of the time, the miners stooped, or crawled, or lay prone. They chipped at walls that threatened to collapse, listening for creaks in the timbers. The slightest shift in air could mean a methane pocket. Fire damp, they called it. One spark, and the entire tunnel would become a furnace. In some mines, children were trappers. Their job was to sit alone for hours beside trapdoors, opening and closing them to control airflow. They sat in the dark, all day, alone, waiting for footsteps, without books, without voices, just the tick of the candle and the rumble of passing carts. It was not life, it was function. The light came from flickering lamps pinned to caps, the flame barely enough to see the next few steps. One false move, one missed breath, and it was over. Men died in collapses. Boys drowned in sudden floods. Mothers lost sons in the same tunnels where they themselves still labored. The miners' clothes were rags. Their boots, if they had any, wore through in weeks. Their skin never fully came clean. The soot embedded beneath their nails, in the creases of their eyes, between their teeth. Even in sleep they coughed. Even in dreams they were underground. But they mattered. Coal powered the world. Every train that thundered across the country, every factory that roared into the night, every iron ship that split the sea, all of them depended on coal. And coal did not come gently. It was wrested from the bowels of the earth by the smallest, most forgotten hands. When Charles Dickens imagined the depths of misery, he pictured a miner's home. In A Christmas Carol, Scrooge visits a family whose warmth comes not from joy, but from labor. They labor in the bowels of the earth, Dickens wrote, and yet their spirit was not broken. But he knew the truth. Many spirits were. Children were sold into this work. Orphans, workhouse boys, girls too poor for school. Families were paid per basket hauled, so every hand counted. A child's body was perfect for narrow seams, thin, pliable, disposable. The pay was barely enough. A man could work a 12-hour shift and still not afford bread for his family. A child's wages went straight to the table, or the landlord. No luxury, no relief, no upward path, just coal and pain. In 1842, a commission investigated the horrors of child labor in the mines. The testimony shocked even hardened officials. One girl, aged 8, described dragging coal for miles each day in the dark, her belt cutting into her hips. Another, a boy of 9, was found crushed under a tub he couldn't lift. Their voices, too small for history, briefly reached the surface. But the mines kept taking. The miners sang sometimes to remember the sky. Their songs were soft, mournful, full of longing, not rebellion. They weren't hoping to change the system, just to survive it. Still, change did come, slowly. Parliament passed acts limiting child labour. Reformers printed photographs of soot-streaked faces and gnarled hands. Public sentiment shifted. Machines began to replace the smallest workers. But it took decades. Decades of lost limbs, blackened lungs and forgotten graves. And coal kept rising. By the late 1800s, the demand was even greater. Empire needed fuel. War needed fuel. Industry needed fuel. And the miner was still there, candle on cap, pick in hand, coughing in the dark. Some miners never saw sunlight except on Sundays. Others died by 30. They were not remembered as heroes. Their names filled no monuments. Their stories were buried beneath the very earth they chipped away. But their work, backbreaking, humiliating, exhausting, built the modern world. They enabled locomotives to scream across continents. They kept factories running through fog and frost. They heated homes, powered steamships, lit gas lamps in cobbled alleys. And they paid for it with skin, bone, and time. They did not choose this. They were born into it, pulled underground by poverty, by class, by a society that saw them as expendable labor. And yet, they endured. Day after day, tunnel after tunnel, cart after cart. Today, the coal mine is quieter. Some have shut down. Some have become museums. But walk those tunnels, and you'll still feel the air, heavy, damp, pregnant with memory. You'll see the scratches in the wall, where a child once scraped his name before dying of a collapsed lung. You'll feel the ghost of black dust settling in your throat. Because coal miners didn't just power engines. They powered history, and we built our world on their suffering. They were miners. Their job was miserable, and it mattered. You didn't die in the streets, but you also didn't live. You entered the workhouse with your head down, your hands shaking, not from cold, but from shame. Outside, the fog of Victorian Britain clung to the brick like mildew. Inside, it was worse. The air wasn't just damp, it was disciplined, regulated. Everything you owned was taken at the door. Everything you were stripped away shortly after. It was called charity, but it felt more like a sentence. They gave you a uniform, a sackcloth tunic the color of ash. No buttons, no softness, no shape. You were no longer a man or a woman. You were a mouth to feed, a body to punish, a number on a ledger. Mothers were separated from sons, husbands from wives. Children were lined up like factory stock and walked to their dormitories in silence. This was the price of survival in 19th century Britain. The New Poor Law of 1834 had one goal: to make poverty as unappealing as possible. If you entered a workhouse, it meant you had exhausted every other mercy. You had no home, no kin, no choice, and so the state welcomed you, not with compassion, but with calculation. At dawn, the bell rang. That sound would haunt you. It wasn't loud, but it never failed. It woke you on straw-filled mats laid on wooden boards in a room so cold the air bit your skin. The blankets, if they came, smelled of bleach and other bodies. You dressed in silence. You walked in lines. You prayed aloud. And then you worked, but not work that fulfilled. Not the crafts of a shoemaker or a weaver or a smith. In the workhouse, labour was made pointless on purpose. You crushed old ropes into oakum, threadbare bits of hemp that bloodied your fingers. You picked apart rags until your nails split. You ground bones for fertilizer. You pumped water into tanks that didn't need filling. turned wheels that circled endlessly, swept stone courtyards already clean. Tasks selected not for their outcome, but for their indignity. Work wasn't a path to dignity here. It was part of the punishment. Meals were worse than meagre. Breakfast was often gruel, a thin grey porridge that stuck in your throat. Some days there was bread, sometimes a lump of cheese, but rarely both. There was no salt, no fruit, no meat, just fuel. And even that barely came. If you spoke during meals, you were reprimanded. If you wept, you were ignored. Hunger was expected. Gratitude was demanded. The silence was almost sacred. And the cruelty was quiet, institutional. No overseer beat you with whips. They didn't have to. The system itself was a blade. Every rule was designed to remind you that your worth had expired, that you were not deserving of comfort or colour or choice. The floors were stone, the walls were bare, the windows were few, and the loneliness was infinite. Imagine a child, not yet 10, taken from her mother at the gate. She wakes in a dormitory of girls with shaved heads, identical tunics, and hollow eyes. She is not allowed to speak to her brother. She is not allowed to see her father. Her only friend is a wooden doll she made from firewood, until that too is confiscated. Personal possessions were forbidden. Even memories felt unwelcome. There were baths, once a week maybe. Cold water, no privacy, no kindness. You stood naked in a line and were scrubbed like a pan. Not for hygiene, but control. Lice thrived. So did dysentery. Tuberculosis whispered from bed to bed. And yet, for many, it was still safer than the streets. Some tried to run. A few climbed walls at night, desperate to return to family or freedom. Most were caught, returned, marked, their food reduced, their beds moved to the coldest wing. And over time, they stopped trying. What broke first wasn't the body, it was the will. Men who had once tilled land or held tools now pushed brooms in endless circles. Women who had nursed children now untangled lint. Elders who had sung at hearths now counted buttons for no reason at all. And children who should have laughed learned to be quiet. The workhouse wasn't a place for redemption. It was a place where society filed away its unwanted, neatly, efficiently, silently. And yet, it mattered. Not because it uplifted, but because it revealed the values of the age. The workhouse system was the Victorian solution to poverty, a mechanical answer to a human problem. It told the respectable classes they were safe. It told the poor, suffer out of sight. It mattered because it kept thousands from starvation, but only just. It mattered because it sparked outrage, because Dickens, in his ink-stained fury, gave the world Oliver Twist, because the image of a starving boy asking for more rattled the spine of a complacent nation, because eventually the whispers turned into a roar. Reformers came, journalists exposed, photographs showed the inside, the gaunt cheeks, the overcrowded dormitories, the unblinking eyes of children who had already seen too much. And slowly, policy shifted. Local laws eased. Inspectors were dispatched. In the 20th century, many workhouses were shut or repurposed into hospitals and care homes. But the shadows never left. In some buildings, the stone floors still echo with invisible footsteps. In some corners, the air still carries a trace of bleach and bread crusts. The legacy remains, in archives, in fiction, in quiet family stories that begin with, "Your great-grandmother was in the workhouse." And so we remember, not because these lives were glamorous or exceptional, but because they were ordinary. And that ordinariness was met with cruelty. Because a system that treats poverty as a crime will never be just. Because the poor were punished simply for being poor. And because when the world says, you should be grateful to be fed, someone must answer, but at what cost? They were the inmates of the workhouse. Their job was not chosen. Their suffering was not imagined. Their lives were miserable, and they mattered. The sea glittered under the Mediterranean sun, but beneath its gleam was agony, long, rhythmic, inescapable. They were the forgotten engines of conquest. Not sailors, not soldiers, not even crew. They were property, flesh chained to wood, lives spent in motion but going nowhere. You called them galley slaves. They called themselves nothing at all. Each morning was the same, or what passed for morning. For many, light never reached them. Deep in the lower decks of the galley, rows of men sat, backs bowed, wrists manacled to splintered oars. The benches were hard, the space tighter than a coffin. One oar to every 2 or 3 men, and the orders came not from words, but from the beat of a drum. 1 thud, pull, 2, pull harder, 3, pull until your vision goes white and your shoulders scream. Their arms moved like machines, and yet they were human at first. But over time, that difference blurred. In Rome, they were slaves captured from conquered lands. In Ottoman fleets, they were Christian prisoners shackled by the dozens. In France and Spain, they were convicts, thieves, rebels, dissenters. In Venice, they were heretics. But once inside the galley, distinctions dissolved. The sun punished them all the same. They rode through sickness, through hunger, through bleeding hands and festering sores. If they collapsed, they were beaten. If they hesitated, they were replaced. If they died, and many did, their bodies were thrown overboard, their chains still rattling in the salt spray. The stench on a galley was legendary. Sweat, urine, vomit, blood, and the sea, ever present, lapping against the hull as if mocking their chains. Some rode in open air under blistering sun. Others, worse off, worked in darkness below deck, lungs full of tar and brine, with barely enough space to turn their heads. Their daily sustenance: a crust of bread, a cup of brackish water, sometimes thin gruel, and for this they gave their breath, their strength, and eventually their lives. They were not prisoners with a sentence. They were condemned with no clock. Time didn't pass here. It bled. Imagine a man chained for 20 years, his wrists scarred from iron, his legs thin from disuse. He doesn't remember his homeland's air, only the heat of rowing under cannon fire. He cannot stand fully upright. He does not speak. He only rows. And yet, it mattered, because empires moved on their backs. Galleys were the muscle of Mediterranean warfare. Long, lean ships with dozens of oars. They could cut through still waters faster than sails. They could maneuver in tight harbors, ambush ports, ram enemy hulls. Their power didn't come from wind. It came from sinew. Without these men, Rome doesn't expand. Without them, the Crusades don't reach Jerusalem. Without them, Ottoman fleets don't strike Venetian outposts. Each battle they rode toward was a conquest not of glory, but of survival, for everyone but them. In paintings you'll see the galley, majestic, its prow raised, its cannons gleaming. What you don't see are the eyes beneath the oarlocks, the sunken cheeks, the bleeding hands. No historian puts their names on banners, but their labor made those banners fly. One French naval doctor once admitted, "No cannon fires without them. No powder moves forward unless passed by chained hands." Even the gun decks depended on their rhythm. The irony was brutal. They made war possible, but were never meant to survive it, and survival was no guarantee. If the ship was hit, they drowned, still chained. If the vessel capsized, there was no escape. Shackled men do not swim. And some captains, facing defeat, ordered the slaves cut loose, not for mercy, but to lighten the ship. They were not soldiers, but they were casualties. Every war they enabled left them more broken, more forgotten. A few, like Jean Martin, lived to tell. He had been condemned in the early 1700s. He survived years at the oar. His memoir, terse and haunted, calls it labor hard beyond comparison. He speaks of the silence between commands, where only the creak of wood and the hiss of water marked time. The silence was worse than the shouting, and at night there was no rest. Slaves slept chained to the same rails they rode beside. Rats scurried across their chests. The wood was always damp. Wounds didn't heal. Joints stiffened into deformity. Some went blind from sun and salt, others deaf from cannon blasts. Still, the drumbeat returned, and they rode. The drumbeat was everything. It replaced thought, erased memory. The only rhythm that mattered was not the pulse in your chest. It was the beat that kept you from being whipped. That told you when to lift, when to pull, when to suffer in synchrony. Rebellion was suicide. Slaves who defied orders were flogged. Some were maimed. A few, legends say, were blinded to prevent escape or mutiny. But most didn't resist. Not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked hope. Even the light was cruel. When the sun fell low and dusk spread across the sea, the silhouette of the galley cast long shadows across the water, as if the ship itself bore the memory of those it devoured. Why remember them? Because they gave everything and got nothing. Because the thrones of Europe and the empire of the Ottomans and the republics of Venice and Genoa all owed their victories to a force that never asked for glory. Because the worst kind of slavery isn't just physical. It's the kind where the world forgets you ever existed. Because every nation that sailed a galley left behind the echo of a drumbeat no monument ever marks. When you walk the polished deck of a naval museum, when you hear the romance of maritime conquest, when you see a painting of sails and cannons and glorious battles at sea, remember the ones below, the ones whose arms pulled history forward, the ones whose breath was the wind for kingdoms, the ones who never saw the horizon they helped their masters reach. He was a galley slave. His job was miserable, and it mattered. They were told it was safe, that the light on their fingers was a gift of modern science, that the glow in their mouths was nothing to fear. In the factories of early 20th century America, young women bent over workbenches, their lips sharpening brushes tipped with death. They were the Radium Girls, in Orange, New Jersey, in Ottawa, Illinois, in dusty towns wrapped in war effort and scientific marvel. They came by the dozens, 16, 17, maybe 20. Some still wore school ribbons in their hair. They painted tiny numbers on watch dials, aircraft panels, instrument gauges. Radium paint, luminous green, a miracle of visibility in the dark. Soldiers needed it. Clocks needed it. The world needed it. And the girls, they were told to lick their brushes. It was called lip pointing. Dip the bristles, shape them with your tongue, apply the paint. 1,000 times a shift, 1,000 tiny tastes of radium. It felt like chalk, tasteless, odorless, innocent. The factory air smelled faintly of chlorine and dust. The girls joked that they glowed, and they did. Their hair, their skin, even their breath shimmered faintly in the dark rooms. On Friday nights, some dusted their dresses with the paint for dances. Radiance was the style of the age, and they were the center of it. But inside their bodies, something else was happening. The paint was building in their bones. Radium, once hailed as a cure-all, was no miracle. It was a killer. It nestled deep in the marrow, replacing calcium, burning silently. At first, there were toothaches, then ulcers. Then the teeth fell out. Jaws turned soft, disintegrating in the hands of dentists. One girl bled from her gums so badly she couldn't eat. Another found that her breath smelled like death, a metallic stench no soap could hide. Doctors didn't understand. Some called it syphilis, accusing the girls of indecency. Others suggested hysteria, but then too many came forward. Too many glowing corpses. Too many bones turned to sponge. Molly Maggia was one of the first. Her jaw literally detached in the dentist's hand. Holes formed in her skull. By the time she died, at 24, the infection had spread to her throat and spine. She weighed 70 pounds, and her body, still glowing, was buried in a lead-lined coffin. Still, the factories denied it. Executives said the paint was harmless, that the girls had exaggerated, that illness came from poor hygiene or other causes. But the truth leaked like radium dust, slow, invisible, fatal. They were paid well, at first, more than most women could earn elsewhere. It was considered elegant work, clean, dainty, precision painting in quiet rooms. But the wages came with a hidden cost: cancer, anemia, shattered spines, organ failure. Some girls lived just long enough to sue. Most didn't. They were mocked too. Called dope girls by factory owners. Their complaints dismissed as greed. But these weren't lawsuits for riches. They were cries for recognition, for someone to say, "This happened." In 1927, 5 women sued the United States Radium Corporation. They couldn't stand during the trial. Some couldn't speak. They whispered their testimony from hospital beds. One journalist called them ghosts in the courtroom. The case was historic. It wasn't just about radium. It was about workers' rights, about whether a woman's body mattered less than a clock face. The defense stalled, hoping the girls would die before judgment, and some did, but others endured. Grace Fryer, who led the charge, spent years preparing. She wore braces to hold her crumbling spine upright. Her teeth were gone. Her bones glowed in X-rays like lanterns. And still, she fought. They won. Eventually. In 1938, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the dying. Companies were forced to change practices. Protections were added. Radium paint was banned. Workers were given masks. Ventilation improved. And the Radium Girls, already dead, already dying, became martyrs of a safer future. Their legacy shaped labor laws. Occupational medicine was born from their wounds. The idea that companies could be held accountable for slow death. That began with them. And though their bodies crumbled, their voices changed history. Even Marie Curie, who discovered radium, visited one of the factories once. She saw the sallow faces, the trembling hands. By then, she too was sick with radiation poisoning. But it was too late. For them, for her, for a generation taught to trust the glowing promise of science. Some families refused to bury the girls near others. They feared contagion, that the bones, still glowing, might curse the ground. So the girls were hidden in remote plots, in metal-lined boxes. Even in death, they were isolated. But they mattered. They made the modern world visible. They lit the way for pilots, for sailors, for the clocks ticking in every home. They brought beauty to the battlefield. and their suffering gave rise to rights that protect millions today. When you check the time, when you see glowing digits in the night, remember what it once cost. Remember the girl who dipped her brush, smiled at her glow, and whispered through broken teeth that she only wanted justice. She didn't die for the paint. She died for being told not to fear it. And in the glow of her suffering, the world learned what it had done. She was a Radium Girl. Her job was miserable, and it mattered. He was no older than 12, maybe 10. A child born into a world where innocence was too expensive to keep. His name is forgotten, like so many. But his job was unforgettable. He was a powder monkey, a boy below decks, a boy who ran through fire. The tall ships of Empire, HMS Victory, USS Constitution, the frigates of Spain and France, sailed proudly across the seas. Their sails rippled like thunderclouds. Their hulls creaked with purpose. Their decks groaned under the weight of war. But beneath those grand banners and timbered flags, beneath the gold-buttoned officers and sea-hardened captains, scurried the smallest crew members of all, barefoot boys carrying death in their arms. When the drums of battle beat, when enemy sails darkened the horizon, the boys were summoned. No armor, no musket, only powder. They sprinted between decks, from the magazine deep below to the roaring mouths of the guns above. Through narrow hatchways, up and down swaying ladders slick with sweat and seawater, they clutched cartridges of gunpowder, 2 pounds wrapped in linen, trembling like the hearts that carried them. One slip could be the last. The magazine was a sacred hell. Locked away to prevent sparks, it was a chamber lined with powder barrels. Lanterns were shielded in glass, boots padded in felt, and into this chamber walked boys, small enough to fit, fast enough to matter, fragile enough to die without a sound. When battle began, the ship shook, the deck quaked, cannons fired in rhythmic rage, and every blast demanded more powder. So the monkey ran, past the surgeon's table where groaning men bled, past the hammocks where his friends once swung, past blood and splinters and the echo of shots slamming into timber. He ran with a fuse in his arms and fire in his wake. The air was thick, soot, sweat, and the sulphur sting of war. It burned the lungs, it blurred the eyes, and always there was screaming, the roar of captains, the bark of midshipmen, the thunder of guns. Some boys wept, others went mute, many went deaf. In journals, sailors wrote of these brave little monkeys, their faces streaked with soot and fear. One captain called them the most important link in a human chain. Another wrote that a single monkey gone missing could break the entire rhythm of battle. Because without powder, there was no cannon fire. Without cannon fire, there was no victory. Some boys tripped and never got up. Some were caught in crossfire, shrapnel to the chest, or splinters 3 feet long, lodged in bellies. Some never made it out of the magazine. A single spark, a careless knock, and the ship erupted from within. There are tales, grim tales, of boys buried at sea in canvas sacks, no name on their lips, just powder on their skin. And yet, even in peacetime, their suffering did not sleep. The powder monkey was not dismissed after battle. He scrubbed decks, polished brass, coiled ropes until his fingers bled. He slept in cramped corners, often beside the cannon he had served. He awoke with the rocking ship. He ate hardtack full of weevils and drank brine-thick water. His world was timber and tar, salt and silence. He was paid in shillings, pocket change for a life. And why? Because navies needed him, because empires hungered for powder-fed guns, because the cannon must never go silent. These were not voluntary jobs. Many boys were orphans. Some were pressed into service, pulled from docks or poorhouses. Others were sons of seamen, thrown into duty before they could write their names. There was no time for school, no time for play, only time for powder. During the Napoleonic Wars, hundreds of ships depended on these boys, and in the American Navy, the tradition continued. Young boys dodging cannon smoke to keep the guns alive. Their names appear rarely in the logs, but when they do, they often vanish soon after. Fell from rigging. Lost in action. Killed by misfire. Some were awarded medals. Many were forgotten before the war ended, but they mattered. The ship depended on rhythm. One gun might need a dozen men to load, aim, and fire. But if the powder monkey faltered, the chain collapsed. He was the runner, the heartbeat, the thread between boom and silence. Naval power won empires, and powder monkeys won naval power. Art from the age shows them small and barefoot, running between rows of towering men. Poems called them children of thunder, and sailors, hardened and rough, wept for the ones they lost. After a battle, the deck would be stained black, burnt wood, blood, powder, and somewhere in that silence would be a small smear, a soot shadow where a boy once stood. No grave, no monument, just a ship that sailed on without him. And yet his legacy lingers. The powder monkey became a symbol of courage in youth, of vulnerability wrapped in necessity, of the forgotten gears behind the glory of empire. Modern navies remember them with reverence. Museums display tiny uniforms and carved cartridges. Writers, decades later, mourned how such young lives were offered to war. Some grew up, a few became sailors, fewer became officers, but most faded out with the tide, sick from smoke, broken by hardship, or simply unnamed casualties of history. And when you think of war, of empire, of cannon-laced ships cresting waves toward glory, remember who fed the guns, not the captain with his hat, not the general in gold, but the boy who ran barefoot through a storm of fire, holding death in his arms, for a flag he barely understood. He was a powder monkey. His job was miserable, and it mattered. He walked behind curtains, never ahead, not from humility, but from history. In the grand pageant of Tokugawa, Japan, where the emperor sat as a shadow behind the shogun, and the samurai polished their honor as fiercely as their swords, he had no place among them. Yet his role shaped the order they so prized. He was the koyoshi, the executioner, the hand that severed, the shadow that kept peace. And no one met his eyes. Each morning began in silence, not meditative, rejected. The executioner rose in a village built for the unclean, in a house untouched by respect. He dressed in plain black, no sash, no sign of rank. His bloodline bore a different crest, stigma. He could not dine in inns. His children could not enter temples or schools. And when he approached, people crossed the road, not out of fear, but revulsion. The Burakumin caste was below the farmers, beneath the merchants, outside the samurai code. They were not criminals, but they were born tainted, because they touched death. And so he worked. When the shogun decreed death, the condemned was paraded in the square. Sometimes a samurai who had failed, sometimes a peasant who had defied land tax, occasionally a criminal with no name left to lose. But always, always, it ended with a blade. It was not the theatrical swing of European scaffolds. In Japan, the cut was intimate, up close, swift. The neck offered without resistance, the sword descending in one clean arc. The head fell to the dirt, not with cheers, not with closure, but with the quiet thud of judgment delivered. He wiped the blade. He bowed. Then he dragged the corpse to the burial pit. When there were no executions, his labor did not cease. He buried the bodies of the unknown, stillborn children, paupers whose names never graced ledgers. He slaughtered animals for the town's unseen meals. He burned refuse, swept blood from stones, and handled the hidden parts of daily life that society needed but would not see. That was his curse. His hands kept the realm in balance, but the same hands could not shake another's in greeting. The same fingers that executed imperial law were forbidden to touch silk, to write contracts, to be blessed by a priest. Some even said the sword he used absorbed souls, a superstition so strong that travelers refused water from wells near his village. And yet, he endured. He had no journal. His voice was not recorded in temple logs or military chronicles. The samurai wrote haiku. The emperor sent proclamations. The merchant class printed tales. But the Kyoshi left only whispers. Whispers of blackened eyes and blade scars, of children born with no inheritance but shame, of wives weeping not because they were widowed, but because they had married into death. A few foreign observers who passed through Tokugawa lands wrote of him. A French envoy in the 1800s noted how the one who beheads stands outside society, like a ghost permitted only on execution days. A Dutch trader remarked that while Japan had order unrivaled in Christendom, it came at the cost of those tasked with blood. But even these accounts could not pierce the loneliness of the role. Because the executioner did not fear ghosts, he became one. The job's brutality was matched only by its weight. The guilt didn't come from guilt itself, for many accepted their task as duty, but from being treated as less than human for fulfilling it. Imagine being hated for upholding law. Imagine a village built not on crime, but on disgust. He could not leave. His caste was inherited. A child born to an executioner was an executioner. No amount of skill, honor, or purity could cleanse it. No feat could lift the brand. It was in the blood, passed like a curse, locked like a chain. Some tried to escape. A few fled north, changing names, marrying in secret. But when found, they were often dismembered, not for abandoning the law, but for tainting the bloodline of another caste. Even in death, the separation held. Executioners were buried in isolated grounds with plain wooden markers, no incense burned. Their ancestors were not welcomed in ancestral rites. Their spirits, it was said, wandered hungry. Yet society depended on them. In a nation obsessed with order, the Kyoshi was the lever that kept justice from slipping into chaos. Japan had no sprawling prison system, no endless trials. Judgment was swift, and the reminder was real. When heads fell, rebellion quieted. The threat of death, delivered not by sword, but by a man whose face no one dared recall, was enough to maintain peace. They were the coal fused beneath ceremony, not warlords, not nobles, not generals. But the executioner made the edict real. Some historians argue that Japan's relative internal peace during the Tokugawa period, more than 2 centuries, was built in part on the silent threat that execution was final, visible, and shamed forever. A shogun could govern without war because he governed with fear. And fear had a face. No statues commemorate the Kyoshi. No shrine welcomes them. Their legacy is in the absence, in the way their towns were erased after the Meiji Restoration, in the way descendants still hide their names today, generations later, fearing discrimination. But they existed. They broke the silence with a blade. They watched the condemned fall and walked back into shadow. They touched what no one else would, lived where no one else dared, and bore the scorn that allowed others to keep their hands clean. The samurai polished his armor. The emperor closed his eyes in prayer. The merchant counted his coin. But the Kyoshi, he carried the sentence, not for justice, but for control. And for that, he paid the price. So next time you hear a balance in ancient Japan, of harmony and perfection, remember the man behind the veil. Remember the one who killed without hate, buried without name, and lived without belonging. He was not free. He was not seen. He was the executioner. His job was misery carved into flesh, and his role held the silence that made order possible. An outcast's trade beneath a sacred sky. In a country built on ceremony, where the rustle of silk could echo louder than a sword, there was a smell you learned to avoid. It was low, thick, earthy, the reek of decay steeped in chemicals and centuries. It came from neighborhoods unmarked on city scrolls, drifting from alleys the priests would not walk, from wells that remained untouched. There, in the shadow of shrines they were never allowed to enter, lived the leather tanners of feudal Japan. They woke before the sun, before bells rang in Buddhist temples, before merchants opened their lacquered shutters. These were the ETA, the polluted ones, born into a caste of untouchables, not because of what they had done, but what they were forced to do. Their trade was essential, and it was despised. Each morning began with the brine of rot. Hides, cow, horse, deer, arrived salted, stiff, half-rotten. The tanner stripped them in silence. Using blades sharpened from discarded farming tools, he scraped off skin, fat, and memory. The hides were soaked in vats of lime water or arsenic, the fumes so harsh they could peel skin from the eyes. Hands blistered and split open, noses bled, lungs swelled with damp gas. Still, the work continued. The skin was then stretched on frames, drawn taut like a drum, and scraped again. Not once, dozens of times. A single flaw meant the leather might tear during its final shaping, and no one paid for broken leather from an ETA. So they labored with a mix of fear and precision, scraping, rinsing, beating, day after day. The smell was permanent. No matter how hard they scrubbed, it seeped into their nails, their beds, their breath. It was a tattoo made of air. Even a child born to a tanner bore that stench before they ever touched a hide, and the world smelled them coming. In the markets of Edo and Osaka, people turned their heads. They crossed the road, bowed with reluctance, if at all. Children of tanners were banned from temple schools. Grown men were refused entry at tea houses. No matter how fine their wares, their touch, it was enough to taint food, tools, and even greetings. A single gesture could cause scandal. But the tanners were needed. Leather in Tokugawa Japan wasn't a luxury. It lined the armor of the samurai, wrapped hilts of katana blades, reinforced the sandals of Imperial couriers. Farmers used leather straps to haul loads. Merchants wrapped their coin purses in it. Monks padded scroll ends with it. And yet, the people who made these objects were denied access to the very world they supported. Their villages stood on the edges, always near water, a stream or river for soaking hides, and always beneath the notice of the ruling caste. They built their own shrines, their own wells, buried their dead in unmarked ground. Within their caste they married, worked and suffered. To marry outside was taboo. To be seen associating with one was scandal. Even Buddhism, which taught compassion for all living things, made no exception. To handle the dead, whether human or animal, was to incur spiritual impurity. No amount of devotion could clean the blood from a tanner's hands. They lived as if their labor itself was a sin, but that labor was the backbone of daily life. Without them, soldiers went barefoot, scrolls went unwritten, saddles broke under their riders, bellows stopped breathing in the smithy. 1,000 invisible mechanisms of Japanese society all ran on leather. And all that leather passed through the hands of men and women who could not enter a shrine, who could not share a drink with those they served, who could not, in some cases, even look a samurai in the eye. There were no names that survived in literature, no portraits, no haiku written in their honor. Their work was remembered only in the objects they were never allowed to claim. But in the corners of folklore, their lives echoed. One tale tells of a tanner's son who, once grown, carried water to a temple during a drought. The priest, knowing the boy's lineage, refused the gift. "The water may be clean," he said, "but your shadow darkens it." In another, a young tanner girl fell in love with a merchant's son, only to be cast out when her lineage was discovered. The scandal cost her family their trade, their home, and finally, their lives. These weren't just stories. They were echoes of daily pain. And still, the work went on. Tanners worked in silence. In skin-stained huts, over bone-paved floors, they turned death into tools. It was not a metaphor. It was survival. They stitched together a nation with their hands and lost their place within it for the very act. Even as Japan modernized, their status changed slowly. Into the Meiji era, many were still segregated, still marked as burakumin, a name that endured into the 20th century, tied to old shame like thread through old scars. But history is not kind to outcasts. It forgets them. No statues were raised for the tanner. No scrolls penned in praise. Their only legacy was the leather, still soft, still strong, that outlived them. On the battlefields, in the temples, in the homes of those who turned their faces away. And yet, something deeper remained, not just in the wares, but in the weight of their exclusion, in what they proved, that even in a society ruled by ritual, the dirtiest hands held up the cleanest traditions. So next time you see the sheen of an old leather binding, or the worn strap of a samurai's hilt in a museum, remember who touched it first, who soaked it in lime, scraped it with trembling hands, and dried it beneath the glare of a sun they were never allowed to face. He was a leather tanner. His job was miserable, but he made what others dared not touch. What you gave up to serve the Son of Heaven. Not every prisoner wears chains. Some live within walls lined with silk, surrounded by gold and whispering incense, their names forgotten the moment they step out of sight. In the Forbidden City, that vast ceremonial labyrinth at the heart of Imperial China, one could disappear without ever leaving the Emperor's side. And no figure embodied that paradox more fully than the eunuch. He was always present, always listening, and always alone. He was not born for this. No boy dreams of trading his body for power, of having his future carved away to slip through palace gates. But thousands did. Some were punished, others were sold, and a few, desperate or devout, chose the knife, believing the palace life would free them from poverty. What it gave was something else entirely. Proximity to power, yes, but also a role forever shadowed by loss. The transformation was brutal. In silence, fathers held down sons. Knives flashed in back rooms. No medicine, no ceremony, only blood, cloth, and the irreversible. The wound marked not just the body, but the soul. The day after, the boy would wake no longer a son, nor fully a man. He would never marry, never father a child, never sit as head of a household. The blood dried, and he was taken in, and the long service began. Within the palace walls, a eunuch's day unfolded in rituals older than memory. Before sunrise, he might be dressing the emperor, lighting incense, preparing scrolls. Others ran between kitchens and libraries, managing the hush of an empire that believed itself divine. Some oversaw the imperial concubines, ensuring no uninvited gaze met theirs. Others polished robes, heated baths, recorded orders in the emperor's hand. The smallest task could be a test. One wrong turn of phrase, one lingering look, and his life, or worse, his favor, would be gone. But the closer he moved to the emperor's shadow, the more power he held. In some dynasties, eunuchs ruled court intrigue. They passed messages directly. They appointed ministers. They outlived generals. But even at their most powerful, they remained distrusted, mocked in whispers, feared in public, and hated by those with bloodlines to defend. The palace was a place of hierarchy so rigid, it bent the air itself. And in that rigid world, the eunuch's presence was a riddle, both essential and reviled. For the emperor, their childlessness made them perfect servants. No dynasty to threaten the throne, no heirs to inherit secrets. They were, in theory, loyal only to the dragon throne. And yet, beneath the satin uniforms and flawless bows, was a lifetime of silence. Their suffering rarely made it into records. A few memoirs survive, written decades after the Qing dynasty fell. In one, the last living eunuch of China recounts how, as a child, he was led to the back of a temple, how a relative held him down, how he could not stand for days, how the pain remained long after the flesh healed, and how, in old age, he was treated as a relic, pitied by some, mocked by others, forgotten by history. He remembered sleeping in corridors where no one spoke. He remembered polishing jade with bloodied knuckles. He remembered being called a half-man by the revolutionaries who tore the palace apart. In the end, he had outlived his emperor, but not the echo of his loss. Eunuchs were made to disappear. Even within their own court, they used false names, wore ambiguous clothes, attended rituals behind screens. In shrines, they lit candles for others, but were rarely blessed in return. Some, it was said, still wore girls' robes as adults, a costume to erase the discomfort of their presence, as if their bodies were too strange for either gender, too strange for compassion. And yet, through them, the empire functioned. They carried messages no one else could read. They recorded secrets no one else dared speak aloud. They protected the emperor's children, washed the feet of his concubines, and opened the doors of temples before dawn. In times of transition, when emperors died young or sick, eunuchs often ran the court. Some saved dynasties from rebellion. Others embezzled and betrayed, but all lived as ghosts within the silk and stone theatre of empire. Their lives mattered, not because they were glorified, but because they kept the machinery of illusion alive. When the emperor rode out, flanked by banners and golden parasols, it was the eunuchs who had arranged the bolts of silk, who had cleaned the sacred scrolls, who had whispered to the concubines not to cry too loudly. The world never saw them, but the world would not have worked without them. And when the empire collapsed, as all empires do, the eunuchs were left behind. The forbidden city emptied. The dragon throne was sealed off. The revolution came, and with it, accusations. Many eunuchs were punished as traitors to the people. Their roles, their silence, their sacrifice all recast as crimes. Some wandered the countryside, nameless, cast out even from the ruin they had once called home. Others lived into the modern age, alone, with only broken photo frames and aching bones for company. No heirs, no graves marked in honor, no legacy, save for the whispers of their presence in history books. But history is wrong to forget them, for the eunuch stood at the nerve center of empire. He cleaned the emperor's wounds, carried his letters, bathed in the still water of dusk while revolution gathered outside the gate. He was both servant and sentinel, victim and vessel. He gave everything, family, flesh, future, not for glory, but for a place that never truly welcomed him. He was a palace eunuch. His job was miserable, and the empire could not have moved without him. They moved at night, shadows beneath shadows, not monks, not soldiers, not even beggars, but something lower, something society needed and despised. By moonlight or lamplight they appeared silent and slow, shoulders bent beneath wooden poles. On either side, buckets swayed, not filled with grain, not fish, not water, but human waste, thick, foul, steaming from every street corner in old imperial cities. They were called night soil men, and their job was to carry what everyone wanted gone. In the alleyways of Beijing, Nanjing, and Chongqing, long before sewers and sanitation trucks, these men worked unseen. When the rest of the city slept behind red-painted doors and flickering paper lanterns, they began. A bamboo pole balanced across their backs, 2 wooden tubs suspended like grotesque pendulums. Their cargo, the city's excrement, from communal latrines, from chamber pots emptied at dusk, from inns, tea houses, and private courtyards. They scraped, poured, lifted, and carried. Night after night, no mask, no gloves, no praise. The stench never left them. It clung to their skin like shame. It soaked their shirts, their breath, their beds, if they even had beds. It lingered in their hair, soaked into every cracked fingernail. Flies swarmed their path. Children crossed streets to avoid them. Even other laborers, stone haulers, and tanners spat at their presence. They were untouchables, not by law always, but by breath and custom. In Confucian society, cleanliness was virtue. Ritual mattered. The temple must not be entered with filth on your soul, and these men carried filth on their backs. No shopkeeper would serve them food. No shrine would welcome them. No matchmaker would arrange a marriage for their sons. Their quarters were set apart, downwind, downhill in every sense. And yet, their work was indispensable. For thousands of years, Chinese agriculture relied on night soil. Human waste, recycled as fertilizer, was known to enrich the soil far better than ashes or animal dung. Farmers prized it. A good paddy, it was said, needed 5 kinds of water, and one of them came from the city's latrines. The richer the household, the better the waste. And so these men didn't just clean streets. They carried nutrients from city to field, closing a vital loop between what people consumed and what they grew. They made rice possible, wheat, millet. Without them, the cities would drown in filth. Disease would thrive, crops would starve. But that didn't make them heroes. No songs were sung for them, no paintings painted, no record saved their names. They were ghosts before death, fading into the night after leaving their honey buckets behind. During cholera outbreaks, they did not stop. When typhoid swept a neighborhood, they still walked. When war came and soldiers marched past their alleys, they kept carrying their waste, because someone had to. Their labor was ancient, but their suffering modern. Cuts from rusted bucket rims festered. splashes soaked through thin cotton tunics, seeping into scratches, inviting worms and worse. Some suffered lifelong fevers. Others simply collapsed in alleys and were replaced. And the silence was part of the burden. They were not allowed to speak of their work, only to do it. When a child asked what his father did, there was only a stare, a shrug, a shame. A proverb whispered it best. The collector carries the city's sins on his shoulders. And those sins weighed heavy. One Japanese visitor to 1930 Shanghai wrote of seeing silent men hunched under buckets, leaving behind them the fragrance of humanity. A euphemism. What they really left was horror. Another writer called them the unsung priests of excrement, walking through alleys as if performing a grim sacrament. But no one bowed to them. They were forbidden even to drink at public wells. Their only blessing? Anonymity. And even that faded with the dawn. By daylight, the buckets were gone. The smell lingered, yes. But the men vanished. They returned to back alleys and hidden pits, where they dumped, where they rinsed, where they ate. They were called carriers of the 5 malefactions, as if their work invited doubt, anger, pride, ignorance, and blame. But those malefactions belonged to the society that needed their labor and then spit them out. Still, they walked, for centuries, across dynasties, from the Ming to the Republic. Through revolutions and emperors, their poles never rested. Not because they were brave, not because they were saints, but because no one else would carry what the empire flushed away. And so, in the filth, they found their fate. No stories survived, no diaries, only fragments. A quote from a farmer. Without the cartmen, the city would lie under a foul heap. A child's memory. We knew not to speak to them. They smelled of the night, a priest's lament. Even the gods avert their gaze. And yet, when we look back now, with the comfort of sewers and flush toilets, with city lights and clean streets, perhaps it's time to lift our gaze, to see what they carried, to feel what they endured, to admit that even civilization's most polite veneer was built on a foundation of waste, and the invisible hands that bore it. Their job was grotesque, their life isolated, their memory almost lost, but their work, it fed a nation. They walked with heads bowed, not in reverence, but in resignation. In India's oldest cities and newest towns, beneath sacred temples and beside glittering apartment towers, moved the most invisible hands of all, Dalit sanitation workers, the cleaners of what others would not touch, the bearers of what others refused to see. Their labor lay not just in filth, but in silence, a silence so vast it swallowed names, faces, generations. These workers were not simply poor. They were condemned, not by any trial, not by deed, but by birth. Born into castes once called untouchable, their fate was laid before them like a chain. Their lives were scripted centuries before they took their first breath. If they were men, they would clean the pits behind homes. If they were women, they would carry feces in baskets on their heads, leaking onto their hair, soaking into their scalps. If they were children, they would learn early that their touch was dangerous, that their presence could defile. From ancient Vedic codes to colonial census manuals, society wrote their role in stone: to carry excrement, to remove it by hand, to be the invisible filter between purity and pollution. Each morning began before sunrise. A woman like Manisha might tie a rag around her mouth, not for hygiene, that luxury was denied, but to mask the stench. She would knock gently on the back door of a home she could never enter, squat beside the latrine, and lift the lid. There, without gloves, without tools beyond a thin metal scraper or a woven basket, she would begin. Scrape, scoop, pour. Human waste thick and steaming into a canvas tub. Lift it, balance it, walk. From one house to the next, through narrow village lanes, past the temples she could not pray in, and the wells she could not drink from. And always, the eyes. Children taught not to look at her, elders turning their faces away, shopkeepers placing coins at a distance, never touching her skin. The caste barrier was not just belief. It was physical, spatial. A wall built not of stone, but of centuries. Some cleaned the excreta of others with their bare hands. Others descended into septic tanks, dark, airless holes teeming with methane and disease. In cities like Bhopal or Chennai, men were lowered into pits without safety harnesses. They would scoop waste with buckets. Some never climbed back out. No machines were given to them, no training, no rights. If the pit was deep and filled with gas, they would lose consciousness within minutes. And yet another worker would be sent after them to retrieve the body or to finish the job. And if they refused, they risked beatings, arrest, expulsion from even the lowliest settlements. Some were punished by mobs. Others died alone in tanks, with no record but a name scribbled on a page. One activist put it plainly, if we stop working, people would rather die than take our place. And that was the truth. Everyone wanted the waste gone. No one wanted to touch it. Even in colonial times, the British codified their role. In manuals for prisons and barracks, Dalit labour was assigned for latrine duty. Their identity was reduced to a task, a line item in a ledger of control. And after independence, the old labels remained. The caste had changed its name from untouchable to Dalit, meaning oppressed, but the bucket stayed the same. By the 1980s, thousands still carried feces in metal tubs, sold to municipalities or private homes for pennies a day. In the monsoons, they walked through waist-high water, their baskets leaking into their arms. In summer, the contents festered and steamed. The smell clung to their skin. Not metaphorically, literally. They could not escape it. No prayer could wash it away. No soap could hide it. And society made sure they never forgot. They were denied entry into temples, refused service at restaurants. In some villages, they had to shout a warning as they passed, so that upper caste residents could avoid their shadow. One proverb captures the cruelty. Even the air around them stinks of sin. But what was the sin? To work? To serve? To do the thing no one else would do? Sanitation workers were not just clearing waste. They were absorbing society's collective denial. Every load of excrement removed was one less reminder of how human we all are. And yet, through this pain, they endured. Because without them, the cities would drown. The villages would fall to disease. Schools, temples, hospitals, all would choke on their own waste. They prevented typhoid. They stemmed cholera. They stopped plague. When COVID struck, it was Dalit sanitation workers who sprayed disinfectant, collected biohazard waste, and cleaned abandoned streets. But no garlands were laid for them. No applause rang from balconies. They were essential, but expendable. Even laws did little. Despite bans on manual scavenging, thousands still practice it. And those who fight back, they're threatened, assaulted, silenced. But their stories now rise. Human Rights Watch recorded testimony after testimony. One woman said, "I don't feel like eating anymore. My hands smell like the latrine." Another man described his life simply, "Every morning I wake, I wear my shame like a uniform." A boy asked his mother, Why don't the other kids play with me? And she had no answer. Because how do you explain to a child that the work which feeds your family also curses your name? Dalit rights movements rose in the 20th century, not just to demand wages, but dignity. Leaders like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, himself born into a Dalit caste, fought not just for legal protections, but for the right to live without stigma. He once wrote, "Sanitation is more important than independence, because without dignity in the streets, what is freedom worth?" And still, it continues. In India's small towns and outer slums, baskets still scrape across stone. In rural districts, women still rise before dawn to clean latrines with a tin plate. In the mega cities of Delhi and Mumbai, men still climb into drains that machines could empty, if anyone cared enough to pay. Their tools are not modern. Their rights are not protected. Their lives, often not recorded. But their work sustains the very idea of cleanliness. They are not the enemies of health. They are its last guardians. So the next time a toilet flushes, a drain empties, a hospital stays free of infection, remember who bears that burden. Not with machines, not with gloves, but with bare hands and bowed heads. They are not just sanitation workers. They are the ghosts of a caste system that refuses to die. But they are also survivors, defiant, enduring, human. And their story, at last, must be told. You never wore armor, no badge, no nameplate, just a cloth mask soaked in sweat and lime, and the weight of a world that hoped you would vanish before it noticed you. The year is 1896, and plague eats through Bombay like fire through dry grass. People vanish from doorways. Homes seal up in fear. The British erect quarantine lines with rifles and chalk. And into this dread-steeped silence steps you. Not because you were trained, not because you volunteered, but because your name fell into the category they could sacrifice. You are Dalit, or Muslim, or some forgotten sweeper's caste scraped from the bottom rung of a society already cracked by empire. The British need someone to touch death, to carry the rotting, the infected, the forsaken. And when that need arises, they look to the ones the city already pretends not to see. You join the Plague Corps, not because it will save your life, but because refusing might end it quicker. By morning, you're inside the belly of the epidemic. Narrow lanes reek of decay. You don't knock. You break doors open. Bodies lie in fevered piles, some still warm. You wrap them in whatever cloth remains. Mothers, sons, strangers. You do not ask names. You dig with your hands when the shovel breaks. You hurl quicklime into open graves until your throat burns. You smear creosote on the walls that once held wedding garlands. You burn homes down while children cry into rags behind the rubble. And then you return the next day to do it again. Each job is death work, but it pays less than a railway porter. Sometimes it doesn't pay at all. There is no uniform, just rags. Sometimes a scarf around your face. In wealthier districts, people scream and flee when they see you. To them, your body is a warning sign, not just of disease, but of guilt they'd rather not wear. You sleep apart from your family. You eat from separate dishes. Even fellow outcasts avoid your shadow. Some call it superstition. Others call it survival. But in practice, it feels like a life erased from the map. Villagers whisper of curses, that those who handle the dead will never return the same. So you wear amulets. You chant mantras in your head while lifting corpses too heavy to carry. You count your breath, not the bodies. A normal day ends with welts on your shoulders and black under your nails. An extraordinary day ends with a cough. You pray doesn't mean anything. You become an expert in silence. You learn the shape of despair. The plague doesn't care about caste, but the empire does. And so while Bombay's elite flee to hillside villas, you're ordered to stay, to burn more bodies, to cleanse more homes, to break apart funeral rites with bare hands. The dead are not your kin, but grief clings to you like blood. You disinfect latrines that overflowed days ago. You carry animal carcasses on your back because someone said rats and cows and birds were to blame. You bury pets beside people. You tear up mattresses and prayer mats, then throw them into fire. One day bleeds into the next, and somewhere along the way, you forget what your own voice sounds like. No one trains you, no one honors you. If you fall sick, they'll seal your room shut and mark it with red chalk. If you die, someone else will take your place. Not because they want to, but because there is no choice. This isn't war. It's something quieter, something crueler. This is a death sentence signed in caste, sealed by colonial law, and delivered through fear. Your work matters. That's the irony. You're the reason Bombay didn't fall completely. Your sweat, your sores, your sacrifices. They held the disease in place long enough for traders to return, for railways to reopen, for life to resume. But you won't be invited to that life. You won't appear in the history books. You won't have a statue. Maybe a name on a hospital ledger, if the ink didn't run that day. Historians now admit that your work stopped the worst, that without you, plague might have consumed entire districts, that your grim, relentless duty kept the city's lungs barely breathing. But in your own time, you are a shadow, a necessary evil, a walking contagion, and in some cases, a scapegoat. There are records of core workers being arrested, beaten, even imprisoned. When British authorities failed to contain the plague, they blamed those closest to the dead. You. It wasn't the virus, they said. It was you who brought it. Your touch, your breath, your blood. You tried to serve, and in doing so, became the monster they needed to banish. Even your own community shrinks away. Because death work is unclean. Because death work is unholy. Because touching plague makes your soul harder to purify. But you know the truth. You are the only reason the markets reopened. The only reason temples did not turn into tombs. The only reason some children survived long enough to forget your name. In one newspaper, yellowed and half burnt, there is a line, "We are hired to touch death. May God forgive us when our hands do this unclean duty." It's not signed, but maybe it doesn't need to be, because in the silence of that sentence lives everything you gave and everything you lost. You woke before the conch shell's call, before the first lamp was lit, before the priest's voice rose in chant. You walked through silence barefoot, across stones still wet with last night's offering. Your name is not remembered in temple songs, but your work was always the first prayer of the day. You are the temple sweeper, born into a lineage not of scriptures or silk, but of brooms and scars. You were never asked to believe in the gods, only to clean after them, in the great halls of devotion, where incense floats and conches echo. You are the shadow that makes light possible. Not a priest, not a pilgrim, just the one who clears away yesterday's holiness to make space for today's. Each morning begins the same. Before the sky has turned blue, before bells chime, you gather your tools, an old broom, a copper vessel, a handful of ash. You walk the perimeter, careful not to enter the sanctum directly. Some temples do not permit your footsteps to cross the line between mortal and divine. so you sweep from outside the wall. You stretch, you bend, you kneel, never seen, never praised. You burn cow dung cakes to sterilize the stone paths. You collect flower petals, now wilted, once thrown with devotion, now discarded like wrappers, and you clean them all. The prasadam left uneaten. The ghee spills, the holy ash. Everything that once symbolized purity is now waste, and it is your job to remove it. You clear garbage bins tucked behind the sanctum's rear pillars. You feed the cows behind the kitchen. You scrub the latrines no one else dares to enter. And then you wait, outside, in the heat. Sometimes, if the priest is kind, he gives you the leftover rice. You hold it in your hand, still warm, still sacred. You will take it home to your children, and you will not tell them where it came from, because in their eyes, even God's rice carries your stain. You are Dalit, perhaps Valmiki, perhaps from another name no longer spoken aloud. But whatever the name, it is one that society placed beneath the steps of temples, quite literally. Devotees walk above where you clean. They avert their eyes. They do not offer thanks. To them, your presence is pollution. Your body, a breach of ritual order. Some temples build a second door, just for you. A hidden path where your shadow won't fall on the main courtyard. You walk that path daily, sweeping silently. You clean the entrance, but may never enter. You hold the broom, and the broom holds your fate, not as punishment, but as tradition. That's what they call it. Some priests whisper that your family must have sinned in a past life. Others do not speak to you at all. You are essential, but excluded. Revered, perhaps, in a backwards way, but never embraced. You've learned to listen through walls, to hear the prayers you'll never speak aloud, to watch children you helped raise come back with offerings, but never look you in the eye. Your fingers are cracked from washing stone floors with cow's urine, an ancient antiseptic. Your palms itch from constant contact with ash and dust. During monsoon, blisters form from standing in soaked slippers. During winter, you feel the chill of marble seep into your knees. Still, you return, day after day, because temples cannot run without you. The irony is painful. You serve the gods, but are told you may never be near them. You clear the space for sacred rituals, and yet your presence is said to make those rituals impure. You remove the offerings that others believe connect them to the divine. And yet, you are denied connection yourself. You are both inside and outside the holy world, too near to be forgotten, too far to be forgiven. Your own prayers are whispered from behind stone columns. Your offerings are made with eyes lowered. You ask nothing, expect nothing, because this is how it has always been. Your grandmother swept this floor. Your father cleaned the latrines. You were born near a temple, but not inside it. You could hear the bells, but not ring them. Smell the incense, but not offer it. You belong to the space between God and garbage. And yet, without you, the rituals stop. The floors darken. The images tarnish. The deity remains unattended. Because holiness, it turns out, still needs someone to clean up after it. This was your role in the Great Balance, to preserve purity by being marked impure. In some places, you were even respected in a strange, backhanded way. Villagers would nod as you passed, knowing that without your hands, the temple would stink of rot and rats, that their prayers would not reach heaven without the floor you cleaned. But they would not shake your hand. They would not share your food. They would not let their shadow fall beside yours. This caste sorrow wasn't just social. It was physical. The temple floors you worked on were freezing in winter. Your feet split open. The offerings sometimes spilled hot oil on your thighs. Your knees bore the bruises of centuries. One Dalit activist once said, "I will sweep the courtyard of the gods so long as I must. My children will know a life beyond the broom only when I free them from these duties." You remember those words. You repeat them silently, not because you hate the broom, but because you know it should not define a soul. You taught your daughter to read. You saved for your son's first shirt stitched by a tailor. You washed yourself before they returned from school, so they wouldn't see what had stained your hands. But still, the smell lingered. Not dirt, not ash, but centuries of silence, of being invisible inside the house of God. And yet, in that silence, something else grew. A quiet kind of strength. A pride not in being untouchable, but in surviving what others would not. A knowing that temples glitter only because your hands kept them from crumbling. That behind every hymn sung under polished domes, your sweat lay like mortar. You are not in the scriptures, but you are written into the walls. And when your broom rests beside the gate one final time, when your children walk past the sanctum with heads held high, when the caste-marked entrance crumbles and no longer matters, the gods may finally see what the world refused to, that you were not the stain, you were the one who cleaned it. You were taken, not chosen, stripped of a name, a place, a future. Your body made into a question mark, not man, not woman, not free, not fully bound, just altered. You came to the palace as a slave, but not even among slaves were you equal. You were made into a eunuch, a harem, castrated young before your voice could deepen, before your body could speak the language of desire. And once the blade changed you, so did your fate. They dressed you in silk. They taught you Ottoman, Arabic, Persian. They said your tongue should be refined, even if your body was not. They gave you quarters behind golden doors, the great harem, but not to indulge, to guard, to serve the women of the empire, and to remain untouched by any of them. You became the gate, the barrier between royal blood and outside danger, the eyes that watched when no one else could, the ears that heard things princes weren't meant to know. You knew every corridor of the Topkapi, every echo in the tiled halls, the way a concubine's footstep differed from the Valide sultans. You led processions with downcast eyes. You announced dignitaries, delivered royal edicts, enforced silence. And in that silence you lived. There were no wives waiting at night, no children with your eyes. Your future had been excised, long before you understood what it meant to lose it. In public, you were invisible. In private, indispensable. You scheduled baths, prepared robes, wrote letters that changed empires, scoured marble floors, and poured coffee for women more powerful than kings. And through it all, you were called nothing. A man no longer a man. A body with no country. A servant with no resting place. When the Sultan changed, so did your stars. One day you were a confidant. The next, you were in exile. If you displeased the Valide Sultan, your name disappeared from the palace rolls. If a concubine whispered wrongly of you, you might be thrown into the Bosphorus by morning, yet you endured. Even when others laughed, the janissaries, the slaves, the guards, mocking you as unwhole, unworthy. Even when princes ignored you and mothers used you. Even when your own breath felt like borrowed air, because beneath the robes and whispers, you knew your worth. The harem was not a cage of perfumes and silks. It was the cradle of succession. Every child born within its walls was a future sultan. Every bath scheduled, every tutor assigned, every door guarded. It all passed through you. And in this unseen realm, Power flowed quietly. You saw how empires pivoted on the softest voices, how the flick of a veil or a glance from the Valide could shift a grand vizier's fate, how secrets moved not through armies, but through corridors lined in velvet. And you were the keeper of those corridors. Your life was service, but not without influence. You could raise a concubine in the Sultan's favor. You could delay a letter or deliver it directly to the Grand Council. You knew where the Sultan slept and which son had his eye. You knew who schemed, who sulked, who bled. You bore no sword, but your silence was sharper than steel. Still, the cost was brutal. At night, in the eunuch's quarters, you lay on reed mats, surrounded by others who bore the same scars. Some wept in their sleep. Others whispered prayers in languages long forgotten. Once, you watched two eunuchs fight over scraps left from the Sultan's table, biting, clawing, like dogs. Because even in this twilight world, there was a hierarchy. Senior eunuchs ruled, juniors bowed. Each position a rung in a ladder with no top, no sky, only ceilings of carved wood. And at the very top, the chief black eunuch. He controlled the keys to the harem. He whispered in the valide's ear. He made and unmade officials with a nod. His body bore the same wounds as yours, but his tongue shaped policy. He was both feared and loathed. A man, no man, yet second only to the Sultan in household command. You studied him, wondered if power could fill the absence in your chest, if honor could replace what was taken. Some days, it almost did. You wore gold-trimmed robes, walked beside carriages with the Sultan's mother, signed decrees in the name of the inner palace. But then, one night, a whisper changed everything. A new Sultan, a new faction, and suddenly, the harem you served became the place of your trial. You were summoned, accused, beaten maybe, stripped of rank, exiled or worse, sent to distant provinces as an empty symbol. Some eunuchs vanished entirely. Others drank themselves numb or took their own lives in the garden pools. Because there is no retirement for a eunuch, no homecoming, no children to carry your name, no tombstone with a lover's tears. You were born twice, once in flesh and once in silence. But that silence did not mean absence. Behind the veil of empire, you held the threads. You kept the palace breathing. You maintained the rhythm of rituals. You made sure the Sultan's women were safe, the lineage protected, the protocol precise. And when the world outside the harem forgot you, when the historians wrote of battles, but not the baths you prepared, when they sang of heirs, but not of those who raised them, you remained, as shadow, as guardian, as witness. A French ambassador once called you a man no man, a wandering shadow. But he didn't see you fully, because you were more than absence. You were the eye behind the curtain, the still hand on the empire's shoulder, the breath between every royal name and its survival. You lived where power and silence met. And though your body bore no children, the dynasty lived because of your watch. You were unseen, but never unimportant. And in the hush of history, your name lingers still, not as a wound, but as the thread that held the empire's heart from breaking. You wake before the sun rises, but it is not morning. It is not hope. It is the drumbeat of another day where freedom means nothing and survival is bought with blood. You are a rubber tapper in the Congo Free State. Not by trade, not by skill, by force. You do not own the forest, but you live within it. And now, it owns you. Every vine, every tree, every mile of tangled green is both your cage and your executioner. A white man came with a gun, a ledger, and a quota. He said you must gather rubber, enough to make Europe rich, enough to keep your village from burning. You say nothing, because what is there to say when language has been replaced by pain? Your body is lean, but never rested. Your feet bleed as you walk miles before dawn, searching for vines that still bleed latex. You carry a knife, not for hunting, but for cutting deep gashes in the bark. Each slash is calculated, practiced, repeated. A wound upon the tree that mirrors your own. The white sap seeps slowly. You tie a gourd or tin beneath each cut. Dozens of trees, each far apart, each deep in a forest that hums with insects and the ghosts of those who never returned. Sometimes you hear cries, sometimes just the silence of too much heat. You are alone, and yet surrounded by the weight of all who do this with you. The boys barely old enough to swing the knife, the girls forced into silence, the elders broken by yesterday's lash. When the gourd fills, you boil the latex over flame. It thickens, hardens, becomes a black ball. You do this again and again, every day. Then you walk, carrying the ball strapped to your back, skin peeling beneath the straps, breath heavy from the heat. You reach the depot. A wooden table, a white man with a whip. You place the rubber down. He does not look at you, only at the weight. If it's enough, you receive salt, maybe some cloth. If not, he writes your name in a notebook, and that name becomes a threat. You walk back through the forest, but slower now, because you carry something heavier than rubber. You carry fear. What if they come tonight? What if they take your wife, your son, your hand? This is not metaphor. This is not exaggeration. You've seen what happens when quotas aren't met. You've seen a man's hand hacked off for failing to deliver. You've seen women tied to trees and children tossed aside like broken baskets. You've heard the story of Nsala, of Wala, how he returned to the village too late, how his daughter was gone, only her hand and foot left behind, how he knelt in silence, staring at what remained. The photograph was sent around the world. But what of the man? Did he live? Did he scream? Did he curse the trees that had betrayed him? You do not ask, because tomorrow the white man will ask for more rubber, and he will not ask how much it cost you. You do not hate the trees, but you begin to fear them. They become sentinels of sorrow, standing silently as you slash them open again and again. The jungle is not safe. Snakes glide across your path. Rivers swell and drown those too tired to resist. Your skin blisters, your stomach cramps. Malaria waits in the pools. Insects bury themselves beneath your skin. But worse than nature is the system, the expectation, the quotas you cannot reach, the punishments you cannot forget. You've seen boys whipped until they fainted. You've seen fathers beaten with chains, then ordered to work harder. Sometimes you think about running, but to where? Even if you escape the forest, you cannot escape the ledger, and your village cannot escape you. If you run, they suffer. So you stay. You walk back to your hut, bones aching. Your wife boils roots over low flame. Your children sleep with eyes half open. You sit down, and you are so tired, you cannot lift the lamp. You close your eyes in the dark, and you wonder if sleep is just a slow death with softer edges. You are not alone. There are thousands like you, across the Congo, across the Amazon, in Southeast Asia, rubber tappers, forced, broken, named only in reports written by men in suits, far away. They called it progress. They called it commerce. But you know better. Your labor fuels bicycles in Paris, car tires in New York, factory belts in London. You bleed so the world can move faster. You die so others can ride. You don't know the name Leopold, but he knows yours. He signs decrees that bind your hands and call it civilization. He becomes the richest monarch in Europe. You become a statistic, or a photograph, or a ghost. But something changes. A woman named Alice Harris takes a picture. A man named E.D. Morel speaks out. A report is written. A protest begins. And for a moment, your silence reaches the world. They do not hear your words, but they see the severed limbs. They read of the lash. They hear the missionaries' cries. And though it takes years, something begins to unravel. Not your chains. Not yet. But their illusion. They cannot pretend not to know anymore. Still, your work continues. Until synthetic rubber is invented. Until new machines are made. Until men in factories take over what once belonged to trees and blood. And you are left behind. Not remembered. Not honored. Just finished. But history does remember. Not in names, but in weight. In the wealth that once flooded Europe. In the bicycles, the cars, the machines. All moved forward by the misery you carried. There is no statue of you. No hymn sung in your name. But the forest remembers. Each vine you cut. Each footprint you left in the mud. Each sigh you released beneath the trees. And we, now, remember too, that behind the rubber of the modern world was your hand, that beneath the tires that spun industry forward was your back, that progress was not born clean. It was born in your sweat, your silence, your severed breath. And though they tried to erase you, you remain, not a ghost, but the shadow that shaped the world. You once grew rice, wheat too, lentils, vegetables to feed your family, to barter, to bless your land with the rhythm of seasons, the dignity of harvests. You knew when to turn the soil, when to call the rains, when to sit beneath the neem tree with your child on your lap. But then came the planter, a white man with polished boots, a leather ledger, and a contract inked in lies. He offered a loan, a Daden, with numbers you couldn't read and promises you couldn't afford to believe. One signature, one thumbprint, and your field was no longer yours. You were told to grow indigo, not food, not sustenance, but colour. Colour for coats in Manchester, for silks in London, for flags that flew above ships that had never seen Bengal sky. And so your rice was uprooted, your grain removed. The soft stalks of indigo took their place, green and thin and greedy for water. You didn't ask for this plant. It did not feed your children. It drank from the same land that once sustained your lineage, and gave nothing in return. You laboured in fields made muddy by colonial ambition. Your hands plunged deep into waterlogged earth, planting seeds you did not own. The sun burned down on your neck while the planter's overseer barked from horseback. Every day began before the rooster's cry and ended long after the last meal, if there was a meal at all. You tended your own food crops by moonlight, if time allowed, often falling asleep in wet clothes, stomach rumbling beside the cot your child coughed upon. The indigo plant was delicate, high maintenance. It devoured the nutrients in your soil and demanded more each season. And when it bloomed, you harvested it not with joy, but dread, because next came the factory, the kuti, a compound that smelled of rot and dye, with vats like poisoned wells. There you crushed the leaves, fermented the pulp, boiled it into cakes. The blue seeped into your skin, into your nails, into your clothes and breath and thoughts, but not into your pocket. For every 100 pounds of indigo, the planter paid you in annas, a handful of coins that meant you owed more by the time you returned home. The price you received was barely 2.5% of what they earned overseas, and even that was never guaranteed. If the dye was weak, you were fined. If the yield was short, you were whipped. If you asked for more water for your field, or time to tend to your wife's fever, you were beaten with bamboo. If you cried out, your cries echoed off factory walls and vanished beneath the laughter of men in top hats. There were those who protested, who refused to sow, who said, "We are farmers, not slaves." But refusal came with cost. Your house might be seized, your cousin jailed, your daughter threatened. A displaced farmer once said, "We are robbed of our food, yet they say we reap the riches of their cloth." You heard those words, and they felt like your own. Your debt, the first loan they gave you, never ended. It grew like a second crop, a weed that strangled every corner of your life. Every time you thought you had paid your dues, a new charge was added, for water, for tools, for the overseer's mood. You were told to be grateful. That indigo brought trade, that Bengal was thriving, but all you saw was hunger. Your wife bartered bangles for grain. Your mother sold her jewelry for rice. Your child cried in a fever, and you could offer only water and the hope. Still, they demanded you continue. And when the revolts began, when the villagers finally rose in 1859 to say enough, you were there, not as a warrior, but as a witness, as someone whose back had bent too long. You saw farmers shout at the kuti, refusing to sow the planter's crop. You saw fields burned not by accident, but in protest. You saw men dragged away in chains. They called it the Indigo Revolt. But for you, it wasn't rebellion. It was survival. Poet Dinabandhu Mitra captured your life in his play Nil Darpan, The Mirror of Indigo. You never saw it staged, but someone recited lines to you in the shade of a tamarind tree. A farmer cries to a white planter, "My body is broken by the bamboo beatings, yet I am toiling for your dye. Is my pain worth this color?" You nodded, because it was your question too. The pain, the blue dye, the ruined land. It was all for someone else's fabric, for curtains in colonial drawing rooms, for trousers worn by men who'd never bent beneath the Bengal sun. They called indigo blue gold, but to you, it was the color of lost harvests, of aching bones, of debt you could not escape. Still, you tilled. Still, you sowed, because to not do so meant worse. But history turned slowly. Word of the revolt spread. Newspapers in Calcutta whispered of abuses. The British Parliament, uneasy with the outcry, sent a commission in 1860. Reports were written, questions were asked, and gradually, very gradually, things changed. Synthetic dyes arrived decades later, and the plantations lost their power. The planters moved on, but the soil they ravaged, it remained, barren, empty, carrying the memory of every step you took, every tear dropped into furrows lined not with grain, but with suffering. You were never given a statue. You were never paid your worth. You were never told thank you. But without your hands, their factories would not have run. Without your sweat, their empire would not have been dyed in blue. And though they erased your name from their ledgers, they could not erase the color from history. The blue on their uniforms, their tablecloths, their fashion, that was your life, compressed into pigment, extracted from pain. The world saw beauty. You saw loss. But even in loss there was dignity, because your refusal to be silent stirred change. Because your labor, forced though it was, fueled awareness. Because your voice, echoed through plays and reports and whispered stories, reached ears far beyond the fields. You were not just an indigo laborer. You were a witness to injustice, a bearer of truth. a root that held even when everything else was pulled from the earth. And though the blue has faded from the world's fabric, its shadow remains in every thread. A quiet monument to the farmer who once dared to say, "This land is mine, and I will not die for your dye." Before the sun clears the ridge, you're already awake, not from rest, not from peace, but from the ache that never leaves. In your back, your lungs, your soul. You rise in the dim light of the barracks, surrounded by men who groan in sleep, some too sick to rise, others already resigned to what the day will bring. You step onto packed earth with feet blistered and cracked, inhaling air that tastes faintly of rot, sweat, and mercury. You are a gold miner, not by trade, by force, by inheritance of chains, of silence, of conquest. Your name, your past, your homeland, they no longer matter. Whether you were born in the highlands of Peru, the jungles of Brazil, or taken from the West African coast, what binds you now is labor, beneath the ground, beneath the whip, beneath history. You enter the mine as light breaks, but it does not follow you in. The shaft yawns like the mouth of an ancient god. Damp, narrow, and carved from greed, it descends in twisting turns and sudden drops. You walk hunched, scraping elbows against rock. The air is warm and heavy. Breathing feels like swallowing steam. Then begins the hammering. Hour after hour, your hands strike stone. Sometimes with iron picks, sometimes just with rock against rock. You dig into the veins that promise wealth, not for you, never for you, but for men with powdered wigs and velvet cloaks, who sip wine in Seville and write poems to their kings. Your hands are no longer yours. They belong to quotas. Your lungs are no longer yours. They belong to dust and mercury. And still, you dig. When enough ore is pulled, you hoist it onto your back. The sack is coarse, the load unforgiving. You stagger upwards, foot by foot, along slippery planks. You have no safety rope, no lantern, only instinct and the memory of the last man who fell. Outside, others wait at the leaching vats, long wooden troughs filled with toxic promise. The crushed ore is soaked in mercury. You swirl it with bare hands, watching as gold forms in droplets like tears from a poisoned god. No one warns you of what mercury will do, how it will eat your mind, how it will turn your thoughts to chaos, your hands to tremors, your body into something unrecognizable. But you learn. You learn when your friend stops speaking, when he screams at shadows, when he drinks river water until his heart stops. You learn when you forget your own child's face. Breaks are rare. You eat once, maybe twice, if the overseer is distracted. A cold maize cake, a mouthful of salted meat. No doctor comes when your fever rises. No prayer is offered when your skin breaks into sores. At night, you collapse on a mud brick floor, not sleeping so much as passing out. The barracks are thick with coughs, with whispers, with prayers too tired to rise. Each morning repeats the last. Each year, you age a decade. Some men are born here, others die here. But no one escapes unchanged. The mind consumes. It consumes names. It consumes youth. It consumes the thin boundary between man and machine. You see boys enter, bright-eyed, trembling with hope. They carry baskets like men. They return with hollow eyes and fingers blackened by ore. You do not cry, not because you feel nothing, but because the mine has stolen even your tears. The earth shakes sometimes, a warning, or maybe just hunger. You've seen shafts collapse, heard men scream beneath rubble, felt tremors like heartbeats of a monster that never sleeps. And still, they make you dig. If you falter, the overseer's whip speaks quickly. If you speak up, you're docked rations. If you resist, you disappear. Some miners carry wounds that never heal. Some lose fingers, some lose reason, but most lose everything slowly. The Jesuit priest once visited and wrote, "We have become a city of dead men's houses. All these trembling hands, all these trembling limbs, it is the gold that wears them out." He was right. It wasn't war. It wasn't famine. It was gold. The yellow gleam that shined in European palaces was dull in your hand. A handful of dust traded for a fistful of life. The coins stamped in Mexico City, the chalices of the church, the crowns of kings, all trace their beauty back to the darkness where you now stood. Your pain funded their art. Your blood gilded their glory. From Potosi to Minas Gerais, from Colombia to the coast, your brothers dug the same tunnels. Their hands carried the same ore. Their hearts bore the same burden. No one asked you if the gold was worth it. They only weighed what you carried. In the colonies, they called you esclavo, though some pretended not to use the word. A laborer, they'd say, a servant, or worker under the crown. But you knew better. A man with no choice is not a worker. He is a prisoner, a cog, a bone in the empire's machine. And when your bones cracked, they were buried in the earth that took them. No stone, no song. Yet you mattered. Because without you, Spain could not sail. Portugal could not paint. Europe could not eat from gold plates. Even China would not have the silver it demanded for tea and trade. The world moved on gold, and the gold moved because of you. You, who no one named. You, who no one saw. You were the one who held the empire's weight, from beneath. They wrote of treasure ships and royal mints, but not of the trembling hands that shaped the ingots, not of the mercury-soaked lungs, not of the children buried without names beneath the barrack floors. And yet, you endured, somehow, because there was no choice, because to stop was to die, and to live was only slightly different. Years passed. The mines changed hands. The empire rose and fell. The wealth was counted in tons. The lives barely at all. But your legacy, it still lingers. In every coin in a museum, in every cathedral door framed in gold, in every story where conquest gleams, yet silence roars louder. You were not the miner. You were the mountain itself, broken apart to feed a world that never thanked you. And now we remember, not the wealth, but the cost. We saw what gold did to men, how it twisted spines and scorched breath, how it gleamed in cathedrals while dulling the eyes of those who dug it. But silver was crueler. Gold was ambition. Silver was hunger. In the high peaks of the Andes, at over 4,000 meters where the air thins and the sky stares coldly back, there stood a mountain called Cerro Rico, the rich hill. But for the Andean, Mitayo, it was not a hill, it was a grave. From the 1500s onward, the Spanish Empire turned this mountain into a machine, and they fed it flesh. You were not invited to the mines, you were summoned. Under the meter system, a colonial twist on Incan communal labor, your name was drawn. Your village wept. Your family prepared your clothes as if for burial, because to be chosen as a Mitayo was to vanish into the mouth of the mountain. You walked days from your home, high into the clouds where snow clung to stone and winds cut like knives. And there, outside the shaft, you paused. You looked up once, toward the peak, and down again, into darkness. Inside there was no day. You descended by candlelight, the flame trembling in your hand like a final prayer. The tunnel narrowed quickly. Walls dripped with moisture. Dust rose with every footstep, clinging to your skin like a second choking skin. Your first task was to carry. The orfebres, skilled miners, cracked the rock with crude tools. You, the mitayo, lifted it. Wheelbarrows were rare. More often, you bent low, hoisted a sack across your back, or wrapped it in leather against your shoulders. You climbed back up uneven steps, gasping in thin air, every heartbeat pounding like a drum inside your ears. Then you went down again, and again, and again. The Spanish crown never cared about your breath, only your yield. If the silver didn't meet quota, you were fine. If you resisted, you were flogged. If you fled, your land was taken, your family left to starve. Some say over 13,000 men labored weekly in Potosi at its height, dragged like cattle, inherited into death by law. You were one of them. And when the ore was hauled out, you helped crush it with heavy stones or crude mills. The dust crept into your lungs. The mercury used in the refining vats soaked your fingers. Your mouth tasted of metal. Your hands trembled. You saw others lose their minds, babbling at stars or convulsing in the dark. The priest called it Agua de Potosi, the shaking sickness. But it wasn't divine punishment. It was poison. At night, you stumbled to the camps, not to rest, to survive. You slept in mud huts with straw roofs and empty bellies. The thin soup provided by mine lords never filled you. Your family, if they came, camped nearby. Wives scavenged, children caught fevers. No school, no doctor, just more waiting, more cold. The wind never stopped, and neither did the mine. You knew the danger. Every man did. Tunnels collapsed. Gas pockets exploded. One misplaced step meant a fall into the abyss. But the Spaniards didn't reinforce the shafts. They reinforced the profits. They built cathedrals with your silver, paved palaces with your pain. Every peso stamped in Mexico, every goblet on a Spanish noble's table, it all traced back to your fingers. You didn't count days, you counted breaths. You didn't celebrate birthdays. You measured weight, of awe, of lash, of silence. And you were not alone. The whole mountain pulsed with the footsteps of the damned. Men from distant villages, men who spoke Quechua, Aymara, men who had once been free. The colonial law was clear, work or lose everything. But the law was not just. It was a trap, because once your rotation ended, once your term as Mitaya was fulfilled, the damage was done. Your lungs wrecked, your strength spent, your hope quiet. And yet, the mountains still called others. Fresh names, new blood. Sometimes you thought of the mountain as alive, not a place, but a thing, a creature that fed on souls and spit out coins. And still, Europe praised it. They called Potosi the treasure of the world, a silver river that flowed to Seville, to Antwerp, to Manila. Empires built their wealth here, but they never saw your body bend. They never heard your child's last cough. You dug so they could dine. Some priests protested. A Jesuit wrote of the funerals held each week, the barracas near the mines echoing with weeping. A viceroy pleaded for reform, said too many men were dying. But silver was persuasive. Reform meant less profit. And so, the mountain continued to eat. You remember the quote, whispered through tunnels like a prayer too dangerous for daylight. Each week, 13,500 Indians are dragged like cattle into darkness, by virtue of their inheritance into death. You inherited land, a language, a lineage, but in the colonial ledger, you inherited a quota. You saw men die on their knees, still trying to lift the sack. You saw boys orphaned before they could grow. You saw yourself, not in mirrors, but in shadows, aging faster than time. And yet, the mountain remained, Centuries passed. The empire shifted. Independence came. But the scars stayed. The Andean hills bore witness to it all. To what was taken and what was left behind. Potosi's silver faded in value. Synthetic wealth replaced it. But the echoes of those tunnels never left. Your voice, once silent, now hums beneath every coin stamped in the name of progress. Your breath, once stolen, now stirs in every wind that brushes Cerro Rico's peak. They remember the silver. Let us remember the miners. Not just the yield, but the cost. Because without your shoulders, there would be no empire. Without your sweat, no grandeur. Without your pain, no profit. You were not the treasure. You were the sacrifice that made treasure possible. And though no monument bears your name, and no history book tells your full story, this we know, that somewhere beneath the wealth of a continent lies your body, bent, broken, buried, but never forgotten. There are jobs that build cities, and there are jobs that keep souls from wandering. Yours was the latter. You were not a gravedigger. You were not a cremator. You were something stranger, older, bound not to earth or fire, but to sky and stone. You were a tower of silence attendant, a guardian of decay, a keeper of ancient silence. The Parsi did not bury their dead. They did not burn them either. To do so would have been sacrilege, a defilement of the sacred elements, earth, fire, water. And so, for centuries, they carried their dead to the top of stone towers, dakmas, and gave them to the vultures. But someone had to prepare the body. Someone had to climb the last few steps. Someone had to place the corpse in his final circle of exposure. That someone was you. When death came to a Parsi home, it did not come alone. It arrived with ritual, with fire, with whispered prayers, and a call for your presence. You entered not as priest, not as mourner, but as the silent bridge between the body and the beyond. You dressed in white as purity demanded, not for yourself, but for the world. You tied your kusti, recited the rites, washed your hands in ash and water. You followed laws older than memory, rules so exact that one error could unravel belief itself. You did not carry the body alone. Pallbearers helped, but only you laid it in place. Only you who bore the burden of Nasu, the demon of decay, the spiritual weight of death. The tower's top was circular, open to the sky. Sunlight warmed the stone. Birds circled above. And you knew this was where the soul left behind its last form. You arranged the body in the outer ring. Men to the right, women to the left, children in the center. You were careful, always careful. The feet must point inward. The hands must be folded just so. Because in this space, nothing was ordinary. Everything mattered. And then you stepped back. You never watched long, but you always heard. Wings. The vultures came quickly. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, descending like silence made flesh. They tore the flesh in minutes, sometimes hours. And when the bones were clean, you returned. This was the hardest part. To lift the remains of someone's mother. To gather the skull of a boy who once ran laughing through courtyards. To hold what was no longer alive, but still not gone. You did not cry, not because you lacked feeling, but because you could not afford to. To weep was to lose focus, and focus was everything. You placed the bones in the central well, the ossuary, a pit that held generations. You said a prayer, then another, then you left. Always through the correct path, always after washing, always after purification, because death was not just decay, it was impurity, a sacred one, and you were its bearer. The community respected you, but from a distance. They did not dine with you. They did not touch your hand. You were the necessary shadow, standing behind the light. You did what no one else could do. You did what no one else wanted to imagine. Each day brought a new name, a new face, a new bundle of cloth and limbs, once full of breath. You never grew used to it. The tower smelled of death. Not fresh, not violent, but slow, deep, inescapable. The kind of scent that wrapped itself into your hair, your tongue, your memories. Flies buzzed, stones stained. Sometimes the wind changed direction mid-prayer, and the smell followed you down the tower steps. You bathed again. You whispered the mantras. You burned sandalwood and begged fire to forgive your nearness. But inside, you carried more than scent. You carried silence. You carried the weight of knowing what came after breath. You saw loved ones walk away from the gate, leaving you alone with the corpse. You heard the whisper of eagles overhead, waiting for you to move. You felt the bones under your fingers, warm from the sun, stripped of all history. And still, you returned, because someone had to. Without you, the rites would break, the soil would be defiled, the fire would be insulted, the lineage would waver. You were not holy, but you held holiness together. You were not a priest, but you made prayer possible. And though the scriptures named death as the worst pollution, they also named your duty as vital. Without you, the soul could not rise. They called you Nasala, bearer of Nasu, the demon of decay. But they also called you something else, in moments of quiet respect. Bridge. A Parsi elder once said, "We give our dead to the eagles. The attendants are the bridge between our souls and the sky." You did not ask for this work. It was given, sometimes passed through priestly lines, sometimes by necessity. You accepted it like others accept sunrise, as something beyond choice. But there were nights you dreamt of anything else, of tending fire, of reading scripture, of sitting in the temple beside others, not outside, not alone. You longed to forget certain details, the way some bodies arrived broken, the way some birds fought too violently, the way a child's bones looked in your hands, too light, too small. But forgetting was dangerous, because forgetting led to carelessness, and carelessness in your work meant ritual impurity could spill into the community. You were trusted, but never fully embraced, and still you stayed, because in your silence was protection, in your shadow, peace. You bore the burden so no one else had to. You ensured that the body returned to nature, as it was meant to, that the soul moved on, as it deserved, that the cycle continued, as it always had. Now the towers are still, the vultures fewer, the sky quieter. Urban noise has crept closer. Steel has replaced stone. Modern funerals offer speed, convenience, control. But some still remember you, not by name, but by presence. By the whisper of your robes brushing stone. By the scent of firewood you used to cleanse your hands. Your work left no signature, only peace. And that is its own kind of legacy. Because while others built temples, you preserved their purpose. While others prayed for purity, you made it possible. And though no statue bears your image, and though no chant is sung in your name, this we know, you were the one who stood at the final threshold, not as judge, not as savior, but as guide. And because of you, the souls rose clean.